OHR for the report and efforts to advance capacity building for the member state. The COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted the enjoyment of rights worldwide. In response, Thai government has put an emphasis on addressing the implications that pandemic has not only on health but also on human rights. Allow me to highlight two examples. First, during a pandemic, access to accurate and timely information is critical to save lives. In this regard, the Thai government, by Ministry of Public Health, has supported the village health volunteer as well as other volunteers to provide those without internet access with important information related to the COVID-19 development. Second, despite the limitation posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, Thailand believes that capacity building opportunities should continue for the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. Therefore, the Thai government have adapted our mode of cooperation to work with OHR and UN agencies to conduct human rights related activities such as joint study on SLAPP laws and related measures between Ministry of Justice and the UNDP, as well as Human Rights Defender School and workshop with the OHCHR. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, Denmark via Zoom. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Denmark aligns itself with the EU statement. Rule of law and accountability are essential elements in the prevention of human rights violations and abuses. Impunity emboldens perpetrators, neglect victims, and enable the recurrence of human rights violations. The lack of rule of law and accountability have effects that are visible in countries such as Belarus and Myanmar. The handling of political opponents and civilian protesters is unacceptable. We remain extremely worried about the recent escalation of violence in Myanmar, especially the continued use of heavy weaponry and even airstrikes against the civilian population, including ethnic and religious minorities. Those responsible must be held accountable. But the cases of Belarus and Myanmar also show us that the Council has relevant tools to apply when human rights violations and abuses are met with impunity. We take note of the recent establishment of a commission of inquiry on Israel's /OPT and await the findings of its work. Finally, we are deeply concerned about the reports on human rights abuses in Ethiopia. We look forward to the joint OHR/EHRC report and to further discuss it in the Council. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Kazakhstan by video statement.
Kazakhstan welcomes the report of the High Commissioner on the work of the OHCHR in the field of protection and promotion of human rights over the course of the past year. Despite all the difficulties caused by the pandemic, Kazakhstan continued to implement political and economic reforms package. According to the decree signed by President Tokayev on 9 June 2021, the government approved the plan of priority measures in the field of human rights aimed at the following: improving mechanisms of interaction with the UN treaty bodies and special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council, ensuring rights of victims of human trafficking and rights for citizens with disabilities, eliminating discrimination against women, including abolishing the list of jobs prohibited for women, ensuring rights to freedom of association and expression. In conclusion, I would like to take this opportunity to inform you that Kazakhstan has made a contribution of $15,000 to the budget of the OHCHR and $15,000 to the UPR Voluntary Fund to support the activities of the Office of the High Commissioner. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Spain by video statement.
Gracias, señora presidenta. España agradece a la alta comisionada la presentación de su informe al Consejo y reafirma su apoyo a la labor independiente e imparcial de la oficina. España sitúa la igualdad de género en el centro de su política exterior feminista y promoverá en esta sesión del Consejo de Derechos Humanos el respeto y desarrollo de los derechos de las mujeres y de las niñas. Dentro de las situaciones graves de violaciones de los derechos humanos, España espera con atención la actualización de la alta comisionada sobre la situación en Nicaragua, la reciente declaración de detenciones de precandidatos presidenciales y opositores, así como el hostigamiento y persecución ejercidos contra defensores de derechos humanos, periodistas y medios de comunicación independientes, suponen un preocupante recrudecimiento de la represión contra actores políticos y sociales en el país a escasos meses de las elecciones de noviembre. España pide que se pongan de inmediato en libertad a los precandidatos presidenciales Cristina Chamorro, Arturo Cruz, Félix Madariaga y Juan Sebastián Chamorro, así como a los demás opositores detenidos. Una vez más, pedimos al Gobierno de Nicaragua que cumpla con lo acordado en marzo de 2019, libere a todos los manifestantes presos y permita el libre ejercicio de los derechos fundamentales de todos los ciudadanos y actores sociales y políticos, que revise aquella legislación contraria al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y que favorezca un proceso electoral creíble que integre a todos los sectores de la oposición, garantizando elecciones libres, justas y transparentes. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation by video statement.
Госпожа Верховный комиссар, Россия последовательно поддерживает ваши усилия по осуществлению сложного мандата, доверенного странами-членами ООН. Исходим из того, что возглавляемое вами управление является подразделением секретариата ООН, и на него распространяются все требования устава, в том числе относительно беспристрастности и ответственности в суждениях и работе. В том числе это касается рассуждений о законности или незаконности решений, принимаемых органами судебной власти государств. Напоминаем, что суды являются независимой ветвью власти. Любое вмешательство в их деятельность, а также попытки оказать на них давление, будь то со стороны национальных властей или международных структур, недопустимы. Просили бы вас учитывать это в своей дальнейшей работе. Не можем согласиться и с продолжающимися попытками произвольного расширения мандата ВКПЧ за счет включения в сферу его деятельности вопросов, не всегда имеющих прямое отношение к правам человека. Мы не ставим под сомнение то, что правозащитная проблематика является одним из ключевых направлений деятельности ООН. Вместе с тем убеждены, что Всемирная организация сможет эффективно функционировать и предметно решать стоящие перед ней задачи только при условии соблюдения существующего сегодня в рамках ООН разделения труда между его органами и структурой. Рассчитываем, что ВКПЧ будет неукоснительно следовать такому формату работы в дальнейшем. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. The next speaker is Philippines by video statement.
Thank you, Chair. The Philippines welcomes the continued efforts of OHCHR to give attention to socioeconomic and development rights, the vulnerable groups, and technical cooperation. The COVID-19 pandemic has stressed the need for heightened cooperation and investment in addressing poverty and inequality and building resilient institutions and communities. It surfaced stronger public demand for an OHCHR and HRC that, beyond cycles of reports and talks, is able to offer and deliver practical solutions on the ground in partnership with countries concerned. To further support OHCHR's constructive and practical work, the Philippines contributed its biggest voluntary funding to support technical cooperation, capacity building assistance, and the empowerment of vulnerable groups. Taking into account the breadth of OHCHR's technical advisory experience and toolkits for constructive engagement, we reiterate our call on states to consider more grounded and effective options for HRC actions outside the more familiar toolbox of panel discussions, country report, and unilateral mandates. Madam High Commissioners, you have cited the need for more practical solutions with real-world value. The annual reports of your office reflect this grounded direction pursued by your leadership. We encourage further work in this area. What actions do you think the Council can consider to support the delivery of such practical solutions? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Hungary by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Madam High Commissioner for her report. Allow me to stress my country's commitment in supporting the work of both the High Commissioner and the Human Rights Council. All efforts intending to ensure the increased visibility, impartiality, and independence of this body and the Office of the High Commissioner are greatly appreciated by us. Even though our membership is over, we are devoted to uphold the same level of productive engagement in the work of the Council. Let me also restate my country's determination in engaging closely with the High Commissioner's Office, as well as the Member States, through a constructive dialogue to address today's challenges, including the ones posed by the pandemic. Hungary fully shares the determination of the High Commissioner to protect the vulnerable ones and to ensure that fundamental rights are respected. It is my country's conviction that if we truly want to achieve real and tangible results, We must work together, engage in meaningful dialogue, and treat each other with mutual respect. Hungary attaches great importance to the thematic work of this Council. We firmly believe that we can and we must do more on issues like the protection of children and their rights, elimination of violence against women and girls, protection of the rights of national, ethnic, and linguistic minorities, as well as the support to persecuted communities, such as persecuted Christians. These human rights priorities are of vital importance to Hungary, as it is demonstrated by our current Council of Europe presidency. Let me reassure you once again about our full commitment to a constructive engagement for the promotion and protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Uruguay by video statement.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. En relación a la consideración por parte del Consejo de la situación de derechos humanos en países específicos, Uruguay desea ratificar su compromiso y apoyo al mandato otorgado por la Asamblea General a este órgano a través de la Resolución 60/251, que le encomienda ocuparse de las situaciones en que se violen los derechos humanos, incluidas las violaciones graves y sistemáticas. No obstante, Uruguay estima también que el cumplimiento de este mandato debe realizarse de una manera objetiva y no politizada, en conformidad con los principios y valores establecidos en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, incluyendo los principios de soberanía de los Estados, respeto de la integridad territorial, no intervención en asuntos internos y el respeto de las normas de derecho internacional. La importante tarea que la comunidad internacional le ha otorgado a este órgano para la protección de los derechos humanos a través del diálogo y la cooperación se verá reforzada en la medida que sus miembros se conduzcan de acuerdo a los principios acordados, en especial los que establecen que la labor del Consejo deberá estar guiada por los principios de universalidad, imparcialidad, objetividad y no selectividad. Muchas gracias.
Maintenant, je donne la parole au représentant permanent du Burundi. Excellence, vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président, le Burundi remercie Madame la Haute Commissaire pour sa mise à jour. Nous saluons les efforts qu'elle fournit pour s'acquitter de sa mission autant que faire se peut, malgré les défis auxquels elle fait face. Et la lutte contre ce fléau ne peut être réussie que par la solidarité et la coopération internationale. Hélas, ces deux principes sont violés par certains pays qui imposent aux autres des sanctions unilatérales. De telles mesures coercitives unilatérales violent gravement les droits de l'homme des populations qui en sont victimes et la pandémie de Covid-19 vient empirer la situation. Le Burundi félicite la Chine pour les efforts déployés et les résultats atteints dans la lutte contre la pandémie de Covid-19. Nous réitérons notre attachement au principe de non-ingérence dans les affaires intérieures des États et de non-politisation des droits de l'homme. Le Burundi réaffirme son soutien au principe d'un pays, deux systèmes et les questions concernant Hong Kong, Xinjiang et Tibet ne relèvent que des affaires intérieures de la Chine. Nous saluons l'adoption et la mise en œuvre de la loi de la République populaire de Chine sur la sauvegarde de la sécurité nationale dans la région administrative et spéciale de Hong Kong. Nous nous réjouissons d'observer que les populations jouissent de leurs droits et libertés tant au Tibet, au Xinjiang, dans la région administrative et spéciale de Hong Kong que dans le reste de la Chine et que leur niveau de vie s'améliore au fil du temps. Je vous remercie.
Merci. The next speaker on the list is Marshall Islands by video statement.
Madam President, Excellencies, during the 44th session, the Marshall Islands with a group of SIDS and LDCs made a statement that urged on the Council to strengthen its climate work and diligently exhaust all avenues to uphold the rights of all humankind, which is threatened by climate change. The statement called for the establishment of a dedicated new special procedure on climate change and human rights. Since then, we engaged with other special rapporteurs to avoid duplication, and we engaged around language to ascertain the centrality of human rights, including extraterritorial obligations. We have witnessed the growing momentum in the Council for this call and for more ambition on climate change. The Human Rights Council must play its role as defined in its mandate of promoting and protecting all human rights for all and the right to development, as well to recommend that bodies of the UN system improve the promotion and protection of all human rights, especially this year of the COP. Recognizing the comprehensive body of knowledge and that the core group has helped created, We hope that during this session, the Council will respond favorably to this call made by the most vulnerable countries. For us, time is running out, literally. Como dada, and I thank you.
Merci. The next speaker is the United Republic of Tanzania by video statement.
Alta comisionada la presentación de su informe.
Could you replay the? We have Tanzania. There is a technical. Next, we will come back to Tanzania when the technical issue is resolved with the video statement, and the next speaker is Mexico by video statement.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradecemos a la alta comisionada la presentación de su informe y notamos con preocupación que en nuestra región y en el mundo se agudizaron situaciones nacionales como el caso de Palestina, Tigray y Nicaragua. México reconoce que aún enfrenta múltiples retos para alcanzar una sociedad equitativa e inclusiva. Por ello, ha asumido como una prioridad combatir la corrupción y la impunidad y generar condiciones para prevenir la violación de los derechos humanos. Reiteramos nuestro compromiso de mantener un diálogo constructivo con su oficina y de trabajar de manera conjunta, como lo hemos hecho hasta ahora, en temas de derechos de las personas con discapacidad, eliminación de la violencia contra las mujeres y las niñas, desapariciones forzadas y derechos de las personas en movimiento, lo que ha permitido crear los cimientos institucionales para asegurar el pleno disfrute de los derechos humanos y desarrollar una sociedad más justa e igualitaria. Finalmente, hacemos un llamado respetuoso a todos los países para defender el multilateralismo, la solidaridad y la cooperación, y evitar la politización de las discusiones de este Consejo. Creemos que el diálogo y la colaboración constructivos son la vía para avanzar en la promoción, respeto y protección de los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is Panama by video statement.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Panamá saluda a la alta comisionada y agradece la presentación de su informe anual. Reconocemos la loable labor de su oficina en apoyo a los mecanismos internacionales de derechos humanos, la implementación de la Agenda 2030 para el Desarrollo Sostenible y la aplicación del derecho humano a un medio ambiente saludable, así como los esfuerzos desplegados en los ámbitos de la paz y la seguridad, la prevención y respuesta de emergencia. En particular, deseamos agradecerle el respaldo brindado a mi país en la elaboración de informes para los órganos de tratados, la asistencia técnica en materia de empresas y derechos humanos, el fortalecimiento de las capacidades sobre los derechos de los migrantes y la cooperación técnica en relación con los derechos humanos de las personas LGBTI. También encomiamos la puesta en marcha de iniciativas estratégicas vinculadas a las áreas temáticas del llamamiento a la acción para los derechos humanos del Secretario General y del proyecto sobre las implicaciones para los derechos humanos de la utilización de la inteligencia artificial en el contexto de la lucha contra el terrorismo. Cuente con el compromiso de Panamá para concretar la prohibición global sobre los sistemas de armas autónomas letales. La pandemia del COVID-19 ha dejado en evidencia la importancia de la igualdad y los derechos humanos en la agenda mundial. Debemos reconstruir para mejorar, mediante un cambio de paradigma y un nuevo contrato social entre los gobiernos, la sociedad civil y otros interlocutores basado en los derechos humanos y en la igualdad de género. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mauritius by Zoom.
Thank you, Chair. My delegation expresses its appreciation and welcomes the annual report. As we are in the second year of the pandemic, we applaud the adaptability of the OHCHR in fulfilling its mandate on different fronts, treaty bodies, Human Rights Council. We would also like to congratulate the LDC SIDS Trust Fund for having virtually organized the Seminar for Africa, co-hosted by Mauritius and Burkina Faso in April, as well as the induction courses being conducted prior to the HRC sessions. We encourage member states to continue supporting the fund to enable wider participation in the work of the Council. As mentioned in the report, the OHCHR has constantly advocated for the vaccine being accessible to all and called for solidarity in the fight against the pandemic. It is in this context that my delegation would like to encourage that organizations do no longer work in silos, given that human rights are indivisible and interdependent. It is in this context that we would like to see text-based negotiations underway at the WTO be completed at the earliest and the waiver granted. We request that this waiver be seen as an instrument that will save lives and uphold human rights and be adequately reflected as such in the annual report. We also welcome the initiative to work out a treaty for dealing with pandemics at the WHO. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Colombia by video statement.
El informe de la alta comisionada. En línea con la apertura al escrutinio internacional, Colombia reitera la plena vigencia de la libertad de expresión, asociación y el derecho a la protesta pacífica. De las 54 personas fallecidas a las que se hizo referencia, solo 24 están relacionados con las manifestaciones, 19 no tienen ningún nexo con las mismas y 11 están en verificación. La mayoría de las protestas han sido pacíficas, menos del 10% han sido permeadas por individuos violentos que han perpetrado actos como el intento de incinerar vivos a un grupo de policías, la violación de una policía, destrucción de los sistemas de transporte público, así como de otros bienes públicos y privados. Las acciones de la policía y la fuerza pública se desarrollan conforme a protocolos y en respeto a los derechos humanos. Toda denuncia de exceso de la fuerza está siendo debidamente investigada y será sancionada. Bloqueos prolongados han puesto en riesgo el derecho a la salud, la alimentación y la vida de poblaciones enteras, como se vivió en la ciudad de Cali. Las protestas no están relacionadas con los acuerdos de paz. El gobierno viene implementándolos bajo la verificación de una misión del Consejo de Seguridad. En cumplimiento de los acuerdos y con un gran esfuerzo fiscal, se han beneficiado a más de 12.000 exguerrilleros desmovilizados. El presidente Duque y su gobierno tienen la mayor voluntad del diálogo con todos los sectores, atendiendo las demandas que estén en el marco de la legalidad, el respeto a la Constitución y la ley. Gracias.
Thank you. And next is Tunisia by video statement.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. يشكر وفد بلاد المفوض السامي على تقريرها السنوي ويعرب عن تطلع تونس إلى مزيد ترسيخ التعاون القائم مع المفوضية ومجلسكم الموقر ومختلف آلياته في إطار الالتزام بمزيد تعزيز المسار الديمقراطي والإطار المؤسساتي والتشريع لحقوق الإنسان والحريات العامة ببلادنا. ويحيي وفد بلاد جهود المفوض السامي في إطار تكريس احترام حقوق الإنسان في جهود التصدي لجائحة كوفيد-19 ونعرب لها تقديرا لمقاربتها المنظمة بالتقرير بخصوص تعزيز الحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية وخاصة الحق في التنمية وتعزيز المساواة بين الجنسين وتمكين المرأة. ومنطلق تمسك تونس بالمنظومة الكونية لحقوق الإنسان وإيمانها بأهمية العمل متعدد الأطراف في معالجة المسائل الدولية وفق ميثاق الأمم المتحدة ومن أجل استعادة نسق تنفيذ أهداف التنمية المستدامة ونؤكد على ما يلي. أولا، انخراط كافة الأطراف في استراتيجية الاستجابة والتعافي من الوباء وفق مقاربة شاملة تأخذ بعين الاعتبار معايير حقوق الإنسان وتؤسس نظام دولي متضامن وأكثر عدالة واقتصاديات أكثر قدرة على الصمود إزاء الأزمات. ثانيا، وضع كافة الوسائل للإتاحة العادلة للقاحات ومنها تنفيذ الدول المانحة لتعهداتها ومشاركة فوائدها مع بقية الدول ورفع القيود على بائعات اللقاحات. ثالثا، تخفيف المديونية على البلدان النامية وقل النمو وتيسير استعادة الدول المنهوبة أموالها لهذه الأموال من أجل دعم قدراتها على تحقيق التعافي الشامل والمستدام من الوباء. وفي الختام يجدد وفد بلاد دعوته للمجلس الموقر للإيفاء بالتزاماته وفق القانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان لحماية حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني ورحبوا في هذا الإطار بلجنة التحقيق المستقل المحدثة بموجب القرار S30/1 ويؤكدوا على أهمية تفعيلها في أقرب الأجال وتمكينها من كافة الوسائل المالية واللوجستية للاستيلاء بولاتها. شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
The next speaker is Albania by video statement.
Albania thanks the High Commissioner for the annual report and its presentation to the Human Rights Council. In February 2020, UN Secretary General Guterres issued in this council his call to action for human rights. Our great expectations soon met with an unprecedented health crisis with devastating impact on human rights. We wish to thank the High Commissioner and her office for actively pursuing their mandate in 2020 in spite of the complex context of the pandemic, for ensuring that rights-based approaches were applied to COVID-19 responses and recovery efforts, for taking steps to protect civic space and the most vulnerable, and for supporting the continuous functioning of human rights mechanisms and the discharging of their mandates. Albania fully shares the High Commissioner's belief in the human rights system as a force to prevent conflict and violence and protect rights holders. Advancing human rights standards around the world will be a priority of Albania's membership to the UN Security Council in 2022-23. We wish to reiterate today our support for an OHCHR that functions with integrity, independence, and transparency, and call on all states to fully collaborate with the OHCHR and the special procedures, including by ensuring their full and unhindered access. Thank you.
Thank you. And next is Cambodia by video statement. We have again a technical issue, so we continue with the next speaker, Sweden by video statement.
Madam President, we continue to support the High Commissioner and the UNSG's call to action. The UN Human Rights Bill needs adequate funding. Sweden is one of OHCHR's largest supporters. Sweden's drive for democracy and feminist foreign policy continue, pushing for women's, girls, and LGBTIQ persons' enjoyments of human rights, SRHR, and the elimination of SGBV. The situation remains concerning in Belarus, where the freedom of expression and assembly are further restricted, and in Russia, where the court ruling effectively banning the activities of Navalny's anti-corruption organization further threatens democratic space. Russia and Belarus should release those arbitrarily detained. The human rights situation in China remains concerning, especially in Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. The continued arbitrary detention of Swedish and EU citizen Gui Minhai has to end. We call for accountability for human rights violations in Tigray and elsewhere in Ethiopia. We emphasize civil society's need for safe space in Egypt, repeat that the intimidation of journalists must end in the Philippines, and reiterate the importance of protecting human rights defenders in Iran as well as Saudi Arabia. We underline the importance of ceasefire in Israel and Palestine. The indiscriminate and recurring firing of rockets into Israel by terrorist groups is unacceptable. The conflict's root causes must be addressed, including settlement expansion. A negotiated two-state solution based on international law is needed. The Palestinian government needs to ensure respect for human rights in areas under its control. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Bolivia via Zoom. Bolivia, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Presidente. Bolivia agradece la labor de la alta comisionada y el informe presentado. Respecto a los puntos a los que hizo referencia Bolivia, agradecemos a su oficina que recabó información durante los hechos de violencia registrados en mi país después de consumado el golpe de Estado de 2019, especialmente sobre las masacres de Sencat y Sacaba. Varias fueron las violaciones a los derechos humanos que cometió el gobierno de facto en Bolivia durante los 11 meses que se quedaron en el poder. El uso desproporcionado de la fuerza contra manifestantes civiles, el uso de militares en asuntos de seguridad pública, los malos tratos y la ausencia de salvaguardias contra la tortura y los tratos crueles, inhumanos o degradantes, incluso en casos de detención en el contexto de COVID-19, un uso excesivo de la prisión preventiva, violaciones al debido proceso, juicios por motivos políticos, intimidación, persecución de periodistas y opositores políticos, violaciones a la libertad de expresión y discriminación contra los pueblos indígenas, entre otros. Por lo que agradecemos a la alta comisionada por su acompañamiento al pueblo boliviano en esta dura etapa. El gobierno actual, electo en octubre de 2020, fiel a sus compromisos internacionales en materia de derechos humanos, reitera su compromiso con la protección y la promoción de los mismos. Alentamos a la oficina de la alta comisionada a continuar con su trabajo, primando en la imparcialidad, la universalidad en el tratamiento de los derechos humanos, así como la lucha contra la politización y la selectividad, elementos que deben ser una prioridad, así como su apoyo a la recuperación de la crisis que ha generado la pandemia. Bolivia reitera su firme voluntad de continuar trabajando en base al diálogo respetuoso con la alta comisionada. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Maintenant, je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Mali. Mali, vous avez la parole via Zoom.
Oui. Monsieur le vice-président, le Mali félicite la haute commissaire aux droits de l'homme pour la mise à jour de son rapport annuel et souscrit aux déclarations prononcées au nom de ces groupes d'appartenance. Nous prenons note de la préoccupation exprimée par la haute commissaire à propos des récents événements survenus au Mali, et à cet égard, ma délégation voudrait donner l'assurance que la situation évolue positivement depuis la nomination d'un Premier ministre civil et la formation d'un nouveau gouvernement. Cette évolution positive a du reste été confirmée par la CEDEAO lors de la 59e session ordinaire de la conférence des chefs d'État et de gouvernement de l'organisation sous-régionale tenue à Accra le 19 juin 2021. La mission de la nouvelle équipe gouvernementale, qui prend en compte les engagements internationaux du Mali, s'articule autour des priorités suivantes: l'amélioration de la sécurité sur l'ensemble du territoire, les réformes politiques et institutionnelles, la bonne gouvernance, la lutte contre la corruption et l'impunité, la mise en œuvre intelligente et efficiente de l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation, et enfin le retour à l'ordre constitutionnel normal au terme d'élections crédibles, transparentes, tenues aux échéances prévues. Merci.
Je vous remercie. And the next speaker is the distinguished representative of Italy by Zoom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. Last June 2nd, Italy celebrated the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Republic. As underlined on that occasion by President Sergio Mattarella, multilateralism, which is rooted in the Constitution, expresses Italy's true vocation to contribute to the creation of a peaceful world where the rights of individuals and peoples are fully implemented in accordance with the rules established by the international community. Italy structured its multilateral leadership on these principles, both in the framework of the presidency of the G20 and in partnership with the United Kingdom in the framework of COP26. The Rome Declaration, signed at the Global Health Summit organized last May by Italy and the European Commission, reconfirms our commitment to global solidarity, equity, and multilateral cooperation. Italy remains concerned for the impact of COVID-19 on persons belonging to the most vulnerable groups, especially women and girls, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, LGBTI persons, and stresses the need to continue pursuing a human rights-based and gender transformative approach, not only while addressing the current health crisis, but also in the recovery phase and the policies aimed at preventing future emergencies. Considering also the special attention the Council will devote to women and girls' rights during the session, we renew our deepest commitment to strongly advocate for gender equality and women empowerment and call for an enhanced effort to address all forms of gender-based discrimination and violence, including harmful practices. We wish to reiterate Italy's full support to the call to action for human rights launched by the Secretary General last year, including its focus on public participation in civil space, and to the crucial work carried out by the High Commissioner and her office. I thank you.
Thank you. Next is Vanuatu by Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Vanuatu supports the need for issues brought to the attention of the Human Rights Council to be accorded proper national treatment, especially to ascertain the extent of state responsibility level of progress and remedial action. In particular, Vanuatu acknowledges important progress achieved by the People's Republic of China, including enacting and enforcing legislation to safeguard the national security and the security of its people. Moreover, in light of recent onslaughts on multilateralism and challenges brought on by the COVID pandemic, Vanuatu is on the view that issues of acrimonious nature will only undermine much-needed global solidarity and progress going forward. We call upon all states to uphold multilateralism, solidarity, and collaboration, and to promote and protect human rights through constructive dialogue and cooperation. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Mozambique via Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. At the outset, we thank Madam High Commissioner for her annual report. We took note of the concern expressed by the High Commissioner on the humanitarian situation in Mozambique, northern province of Cabo Delgado, where terrorist armed groups are attacking villages and committing serious violations of human rights. These attacks perpetrated by terrorist groups has led to the loss of lives of over 2,000 people and caused over 800,000 to be displaced in different parts of the country. His Excellency President Filipe Nyusi, in his letter to Madam High Commissioner, disclosed that terrorist attacks in the country have been reversing our achievements in the provision of basic service. The government is working closely with the UN team in Mozambique and other international partners to strengthen the national human rights system, including in the context of the conflict in Cabo Delgado. The Mozambique Armed and Defense Forces in combating violent extremism in Cabo Delgado are guided by the principles of international humanitarian law and the full respect of democratic rule of law. In this regard, the government of Mozambique has invited the senior officer of the Office of the High Commissioner to visit our country and organize a training course for the armed and defense forces on human rights issues. In Mozambique, the freedoms of opinion, expression, and press are granted, and the government remains committed to protect and respect the human rights of all population. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Iceland by video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the High Commissioner for her report and for her tireless efforts and of her office. At the outset, we would like to underline our regret over Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, a Council of Europe treaty on combating all forms of violence against women. The decision to withdraw represents a significant step backwards in Turkey's effort to advance women's rights and highlight wider concerns regarding shrinking civic and democratic space in Turkey. Madam President, we remain deeply concerned over the reported human rights atrocities committed in Ethiopia's Tigray region, including the killing of civilians and widespread sexual and gender-based violence. We reiterate our call for an end to the violence and for unfettered humanitarian access to all parts of Tigray to prevent large-scale of famine and loss of lives. We urge the government of Ethiopia to hold accountable those responsible for abuses and underline the need for an objective, independent assessment. Finally, Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for her update on the UN Joint Programme on Human Rights in the Philippines and look forward to her updating the Council further in September. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Dominican Republic via Zoom. You have the floor.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Queremos agradecer a la alta comisionada la presentación de su informe al Consejo. El gobierno de la República Dominicana apoya la posición de la República Popular China en el sentido de la defensa al multilateralismo, la solidaridad, la colaboración, promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en el marco de los compromisos internacionales asumidos a través de los principios internacionales asumidos sobre la universalidad, la imparcialidad y la objetividad de los pueblos. Reiteramos nuestra posición como miembro fundador de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, dirigida al respeto a los valores universales en concordancia con la protección de los derechos humanos, respetando el derecho de los pueblos a elegir el camino a seguir de acuerdo con sus condiciones nacionales, teniendo como énfasis la dignidad y el desarrollo de sus habitantes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is Eritrea via Zoom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to thank Madam High Commissioner for her report that we take note of, and we have the following observations on her report. At the outset, it's important to underline that the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights is an important UN body with institutional mandate that bestows responsibilities of independence, objectivity, and neutrality in addressing the reporting human rights violations wherever they occur. Unfortunately, the report at hand becomes one of typical instances in which reports of the High Commissioner compromise the basic responsibilities, lacking verifiable information from credible sources. Three observations are evident as examples in this report. First, the allegations that the Eritrean Defense Forces continue to commit crimes in Tigray is totally untrue and unsubstantiated. In essence, the allegations are counter to the Ethiopian culture, to the Eritrean culture, and they establish high-level discipline, moral standards, and the responsibilities of the National Defense Forces that continue to maintain the values inherited from the national liberation struggle. Second, part of the report relating to the law enforcement operations in the Tigray region of Ethiopia is one-sided and devoid the credible information and preempt OHCHR work that is underway in the cooperation with Ethiopia. The assertions made could not be as updated, only but for faith neutrality as OHCHR is involved in the joint investigation. On the contrary, it's unwarranted to omit the crimes of the defunct TPLF clique in the report. Third, containing the High Commissioner's report, the ongoing trials.
I thank you, sir. I'm sorry, you have exceeded your time and I have to stop you at this juncture. Thank you for your statement. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Tchad. Via Zoom.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. Le Tchad salue et félicite la haute commissaire pour sa mise à jour orale. Le Tchad voudrait souligner que la situation des droits de l'homme doit être abordée de manière globale, sans sélectivité ni partialité, dans le plein respect des principes de souveraineté, d'indépendance, d'intégrité territoriale et de non-ingérence dans les affaires intérieures des États, qui sont les principes fondamentaux des relations internationales, tels que consacrés par la Charte des Nations Unies. Le Tchad salue les efforts de la République populaire de Chine et l'encourage dans sa politique du respect du principe un pays, deux systèmes par rapport à la région administrative de Hong Kong. Je vous remercie pour votre bienveillante attention.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation wishes to thank the High Commissioner for her annual report. We hold the Council in high esteem as it has created a platform for states to cooperate and interact with each other constructively. As rightfully pointed out by the UN Secretary General during the opening session of the high-level segment of the 46th session in March, indeed, Human Rights Council is the global locus for tackling a full range of human rights challenges. In this regard, when dealing with the situation of human rights in countries, my delegation is of the view that the principle of sovereign equality before states should be at the center of Council's mandate. Article 2.1 of the UN Charter states that the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members, meaning that all states are equal in rights and duties. Whilst it could be acknowledged that no country is entirely free from human rights challenges, we believe that states should be afforded the technical support they may require in order to promote and protect human rights of its citizens. Mr. Vice President, it is for this reason that we strongly advise that the Republic of China should be left to deal with its domestic issues as a sovereign state, as we believe that it is capable of doing so within its domestic structures. The principle of non-interference into the domestic affairs of member states should also apply to issues that pertain to Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We would like to conclude by highlighting that the freedom from discrimination, equality and respect to sovereignty of all states.
I thank you, sir, but I regret you have exceeded your speaking time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now go to the next speaker, that's Botswana by video statement.
Madam President, Botswana aligns herself with the statement of the African Group. We thank the High Commissioner for her comprehensive report. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that freedom from fear and want is the cornerstone of our aspirations. The rising extreme poverty, inequalities, erosion of democratic and civic space, and injustice, exacerbated by the debilitating impact of COVID-19, as highlighted in the report of the High Commissioner, all stand in sharp contrast to these sacrosanct ideals. Where the conditions for the attainment of these rights are missing, the UN Secretary-General's call to action on human rights reminds us of our collective responsibility to prevent human rights violations and provide better protection. Botswana has employed the combined features of progressive economic reforms and broadening social protections as building blocks to mitigate the severity of COVID-19, protect livelihoods, and position the country towards a recovery path with the participation of all key stakeholders. Botswana recognizes that all human rights derive from the inherent dignity of the human person, as outlined in the Charter of the United Nations. We will therefore continue our investment in the welfare of our people and undertake domestic measures for the enjoyment of these rights. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And now we shall hear the video statement by Tanzania.
President, the United Republic of Tanzania commends the High Commissioner for the comprehensive annual report of the activities carried between July 2020 to March 2021 by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Madam President, we take note with satisfaction of the numerous activities carried out despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, we congratulate the Office of High Commissioner for pursuing its mandate while agilely adapting to the new circumstances, particularly through remote human rights monitoring and online delivery of technical assistance and capacity building support. Madam President, we would also like to reaffirm that respect for sovereignty, independence, and the territorial integrity of states and the non-interference in internal affairs of sovereign states represent basic norms governing international relations. In this regard, we strongly oppose the perennial practice of interference of internal affairs of countries like China under the guise of human rights defense. Issues related to Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet are China's internal affairs and broke no interference by any external forces. Madam President, finally, the United Republic of Tanzania shall continue to cooperate with the Human Rights Council and its special procedures as well as the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the promotion, safeguarding, and the protection of the fundamental human rights principles. I thank you.
And the next speaker is Cambodia by video statement.
We take note the High Commissioner reference to Cambodia in her remarks. The coronavirus broke out at a time of Cambodia's rapid economic growth, substantial poverty drop, and significant social progress. To support livelihood of the hardest hit families, my government rolled out a cash transfer program for impoverished households through a digital mode and on the basis of equity, equality, and efficiency. Additional social protection packages are being introduced to aid affected families in the lockdown zones. Against this backdrop, Moody's Investor Service classified Cambodia in a group of 3 with the most effective social safety nets among the 7 developing economies in ASEAN. Notwithstanding the health crisis, Cambodia has never shied away from human rights commitments. In cherishing freedom of expression and media, Cambodia prioritized journalists in our free national inauguration rollout in order for them to carry out their frontline work safely and prevent fake news and misinformation during the pandemic. The respect for these freedoms is further reinforced by the fact that Cambodia is one of the world's lowest data costs and the highest use of mobile data per capita among low and lower middle income countries. Over 70% of the entire population are active social media users, airing their views freely on public affairs. The agreement is further amplified by nearly 2,000 robust media outlets operating without censorship. To conclude, my government extended close cooperation to the newly appointed country special rapporteurs who wish to meet our 5 ministers in wide-ranging sectors later this month. I thank you.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker on the list of delegations having requested the floor. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. The first to speak is East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, we thank you for your annual report and your office for its work to promote and protect human rights around the globe and in the Eastern Horn of Africa. Regarding Ethiopia, we concur with your analysis and concerns. The situation in Tigray is serious and demands multilateral attention. The commencement of a joint OHCHR Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation is a positive step. It is one option. Other options can be explored. Based on your universal mandate, we encourage you, High Commissioner, to report on your assessment of the situation and formulate recommendations, including on criminal accountability. For this assessment to be formally presented to and discussed at the Human Rights Council, the Council needs to adopt a resolution requesting such a debate. Together with partner NGOs, we have issued a call for such a resolution. There is also reason for hope in East Africa. In Tanzania, after President Samia Suluhu Hassan was sworn in, she indicated that she would uphold free expression and due process. She sent positive signals for civic space. We welcome these steps and are ready to deepen dialogue and cooperation with Tanzanian authorities, including in Geneva ahead of the UPR. High Commissioner, we encourage you to continue reporting on the human rights dimensions of the COVID-19 crisis. The work of your office regarding civic space and human rights defenders remains vital. Thank you.
The next speaker is International Service for Human Rights, delivering a joint statement on behalf of several NGOs.
Madam High Commissioner, as you must be aware, the human rights situation in China remains dire. Major research reports published in the last 2 months independently reached the same conclusion. The Chinese government is committing crimes against humanity against its Turkic Muslim population. The international community, this council, and your office cannot remain silent. We request that you urgently strengthen monitoring and initiate public reporting on the human rights situation across China. This is essential to providing objective, independent, and concrete information to all stakeholders and to seeking constructive solutions. In your last update to this council, you pointed to the curtailment of fundamental rights and freedoms in the name of national security, especially targeting Uyghurs and Tibetans. Restrictions on free speech and detentions linked to the COVID-19 response, the investigation of protesters in Hong Kong, and the arbitrary arrest and unfair trials of lawyers, journalists, and human rights defenders. In the months since, little has changed. More is needed. We acknowledge your call for unfettered access to all regions of China. We emphasize that access is not a prerequisite for accountability. Ongoing negotiations should not delay urgently needed action. Human rights violations across China, Uyghur and Tibetan regions, as well as Hong Kong, have become increasingly severe, even while Chinese authorities have consistently denied meaningful cooperation. We are here as allies, but the victims and communities urgently need you, your office, and the UN as a whole to respond. Thank you.
The next speaker is Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Madam President. High Commissioner, last session you indicated your office was assessing the rights situation in Xinjiang. Such an assessment is urgently needed. For more than 2.5 years, you have been seeking access to Xinjiang. That's more than 2.5 years in which Uyghurs have been detained and disappeared, subject to torture and forced labor, in which cultural and religious identities have been erased, and children separated from their families. It's also more than 2.5 years that China has been able to ramp up its propaganda machine, pressure states, and bury evidence of its crimes. This needs to end. We recently published findings that China is committing crimes against humanity. High Commissioner, when will you present your assessment to the Council so that it can consider appropriate action? We look forward to your report on systemic racism and police violence. This session will be a test of the US's stated commitment to addressing deeply entrenched racial inequalities. The Council should put in place a robust mechanism to investigate structural racism in law enforcement against people of African descent, including root causes, in response to the demands of victims and families in the US and elsewhere. In Tigray, grave violations have occurred, including massacres of civilians, widespread rape and sexual violence, destruction of hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. The region is now facing a severe man-made famine. We urge the Council to adopt a resolution to address the crisis. It is also past time for the Council to create a dedicated special procedure to elevate attention to climate change, which constitutes an existential threat for humanity and jeopardizes the realization of all human rights for present and future generations. Thank you.
The next speaker is the American Association of Jurists, delivering a joint statement on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
Thank you. I have the honor to speak on behalf of a group of almost 300 organizations, including the Sahrawi National Commission for Human Rights. With reference to our written statement NGO/33, we express our deepest concern about the systematic and serious violations of human rights and breaches of the international humanitarian law committed by the Kingdom of Morocco in the occupied non-self-governing territory of Western Sahara. Following the breaking of the 1991 ceasefire by the occupying power, harassment, beating, torture, rape, arbitrary arrest, arbitrary house arrest, and arbitrary detention are the common human rights violations Sahrawi human rights defenders are facing nowadays in the occupied Western Sahara. In the past 6 months, more than 720 incidents have been recorded.
the 295 undersigning organizations call upon the UN High Commissioner to implement the commitments paid by the Office at the World Humanitarian Summit, in particular by publicly condemning serious violations of the international humanitarian law and serious and systematic human rights violations occurring in Western Sahara, and would like to have a clarification on the reason impeding the Office to renew the technical missions to Western Sahara initiated in 2015. I thank you for your attention.
Next is the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, delivering a joint statement on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
Madam President, this is a joint statement delivered on behalf of several organizations which form TVNet. We thank the High Commissioner for presenting the annual report. We express our appreciation of efforts undertaken by OHHR to support the treaty bodies to continue their work throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. We particularly welcome that all treaty bodies have started piloting online reviews of states parties in the current absence of in-person meetings. Nevertheless, we are increasingly concerned that the limited number of online reviews that can be undertaken in a single treaty body session has led to a sharp increase in the backlog of state party reports pending consideration. To prevent significant protection gaps, it is critical to stem the growing backlog of state party reports and avoid delays to other activities of the treaty bodies. We agree with the High Commissioner that the treaty bodies' work relies significantly on in-person interactions. As such, in order to ensure that treaty bodies examine state party reports and effectively discharge their mandates, we urge OHHR to identify concrete steps that would enable in-person meetings to be resumed no later than autumn sessions of 2021. We also call on states to support and cooperate with the treaty bodies and OHHR in such efforts, including through providing sufficient resources. Thank you.
The next speaker on the list is the Asian Legal Resource Center.
President, Asian Legal Resource Center welcomes the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to this Council. Madam High Commissioner, your report has explained us on how your office has adjusted to the COVID-19 pandemic having significant impact on human rights worldwide. The ALRC could not agree more with you. As you have mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has also starkly underlined the centrality of equality and human rights to the global agenda. The pandemic exposed the effects of decades of underinvestment in public services and made even more explicit how during a crisis, poor governance, corruption, a lack of rule of law, limited access to justice, discrimination, and weak or biased institutions threaten the principles of equality, dignity, and human rights. Millions of people have become new victims of extreme poverty without sufficient support from their respective governments in Asia. The people's demands for food, healthcare, employment, and overdue wages from their employers are dealt with disproportionate brute force of states' law enforcement agencies. Building institutions in conformity with the global goal 16 of the SDG is key to ensure human rights with human dignity for building peace. We would highly appreciate if you kindly tell us whether your office has any plan to improve the quality of the justice institutions to achieve the goal 16 of the SDG, at least concerning the horrific human rights situations in many countries. Thank you, Madam President.
We will next hear a joint statement by the Center for International Environmental Law on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
Your Excellencies, I delivered a statement on behalf of more than 10 organizations echoing our open letter endorsed by dozens of civil society and indigenous peoples organizations. We are grateful for the High Commissioner's continued leadership in highlighting the human rights impacts of climate change. Climate change is an existential threat for humanity, jeopardizing the realization of all human rights for present and future generations, and aggravating intersecting forms of discrimination and marginalization against individuals and groups. While we welcome the work of many mandate holders on climate change, it is now time for the Council to appoint a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. This would not only elevate the Council's work on climate change in a systematic way, but also support states and people most impacted by runaway climate change, foster international cooperation, and promote respect for human rights in climate responses. In 2019, the Marshall Islands affirmed, on behalf of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the urgency of creating such a mandate. a call supported by Bangladesh and 56 other states from all regional groups at the last session of the Council. Having called for the creation of a dedicated special rapporteur for more than a decade, we welcome this leadership. It is now time to act. We urge states to establish a new special rapporteur on human rights and climate change at this session of the Council. Thank you.
The next speaker is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Written statement to this session, WIF has brought to the attention of this Council the alarming situation of human rights defenders in Afghanistan. In 2020, there was a five-fold increase in killings of HRDs compared to 2019. This dramatic increase coincided with the start of preliminary peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Armed attacks by the Taliban against government forces have surged in 2021, and the Taliban regularly issue threats against civil society. The Joint Commission for the Protection of HRDs is still not operational. The government is failing to adequately respond to attacks against HRDs. As impunity prevails, the violence is continuing. This is unacceptable. This alarming pattern is forcing HRDs to self-censor at a time when their voices are the most critical, and in some cases to leave the country. Changes in embassies in Kabul can hamper HRDs' access to international support that is crucially needed. While many call for the participation of civil society in the peace process, especially of women, in order to do so, Afghan HRDs must first survive. WIF urges this Council to establish a robust monitoring mechanism that can regularly report on the situation, and to call on Afghanistan to ensure effective investigations into killings of HRDs and to bring perpetrators to justice.
The next speaker is Franciscans International, delivering a joint statement on behalf of several non-governmental organizations.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradecemos el reporte de actividades de la alta comisionada, particularmente sobre Colombia. A 8 semanas de las jornadas de movilización en distintas ciudades del país, los actos de represión contra quienes ejercen su derecho a protestar constituyen flagrantes violaciones de derechos humanos. Los abusos se producen a pesar del fallo de la Corte Suprema, que insta a la fuerza pública a no actuar de manera violenta, arbitraria y sistemática durante las manifestaciones. Las protestas se vinculan a reivindicaciones estructurales ligadas a los derechos humanos, incluyendo la pobreza, la desigualdad, injusticias sociales crecientes, la impunidad y la violencia sistemática contra las personas defensoras de derechos humanos, incluyendo líderes sociales, campesinas, sindicales e indígenas, y la prensa. También se deben a la falta de la implementación del Acuerdo de Paz del 2016. Exhortamos al Consejo a exigir a Colombia el cese del uso de la violencia y el respeto del derecho a la protesta pacífica, a que investigue de forma independiente las violaciones a los derechos humanos cometidas en este contexto, a que acepte la visita de los procedimientos especiales y a que apoye el logro de consensos sociales en torno a las demandas estructurales. Finalmente, solicitamos a la alta comisionada que elabore un reporte sobre las violaciones de derechos humanos cometidas durante las protestas.
And the next speaker is Amnesty International.
We thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your update. Patterns of grave human rights violations in the Philippines you reported to this council last year, including unlawful killings and targeting and harassment of human rights defenders and government critics, continue unabated, fueled by near total impunity and public endorsement by the President. Now that the prosecutor of the ICC has formally requested to open an investigation into suspected crimes against humanity, we urge this council to launch its own long overdue investigation. In Tigray, Amnesty has documented crimes which appear to include war crimes and crimes against humanity, as you have also indicated. We welcome the important resolution adopted by the African Commission and urge this council to take action to support, bolster and create synergies with these efforts. We remain deeply concerned by the human rights situation in China and support the joint statement delivered by ISHR. A major new report released by Amnesty documents the mass internment, torture and persecution of Muslims in Xinjiang, which appear to meet the threshold of crimes against humanity. We're concerned by the erosion of rights protections in Hong Kong and wider violations across the country. We urge your office to closely monitor and publicly report on China's sweeping rights violations and on member states to take long overdue concrete action to address the situation. on migrant routes throughout the world, we continue to document what you have characterized as a lethal disregard for desperate people, people that are in no way less valuable or less deserving of dignity than you or I. We urge this Council to establish independent monitoring and verification of pushbacks and collective expulsions and the violations used to enact them. Thank you.
And this was the last speaker that we could accommodate at this dialogue. I would now like to invite the High Commissioner to take the floor for her concluding remarks. Madam Bachelet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vice President. Distinguished delegates and of course members of civil society as well. I would like to thank you for your interventions and for the many expressions of support for the work of my office. I was encouraged by the recognition of the office capacity to adapt to the difficult circumstances created by the pandemic and to be able to provide guidance and support to place human rights at the center of responses to COVID-19. And we will continue to do so. I was also encouraged by the expressions of appreciation for the technical cooperation provided by my office to assist member states in promoting the realization of all human rights. OHCHR will continue upholding UN principles in all activities and interventions. My office consistently strives to base its work and advocacy on verified facts. As many delegations have stressed, it is critical for my office to have access to be able to verify allegations of human rights violations wherever they occur. Several delegations refer to the work of special procedures. It is essential for states to support the independence of special procedures. As shown by the actions taken by special procedures during the pandemic, their role is essential in responding to human rights challenges. States' full cooperation with them, including by accepting their visit or responding to their communications, is critical for their effective functioning and for the advancement of human rights. There might be some divergence of views, but it is critical that they are resolved through dialogue and engagement. I encourage states to fully support the work of the Coordination Committee as a key actor in facilitating dialogue and engagement between special procedures and stakeholders. The Coordination Committee has also shown its capacity to improve the functioning of the system in response to criticism. Presenting reports in person to the Council is among the key activities of special procedures. The Office is committed to support them in resuming all their activities as soon as possible, including in-person presentation of reports in Geneva. Several mandate holders will present their reports in person at this session, which offers them significant opportunity to engage with states and other stakeholders. Country visits have also resumed, which is also a welcome development. My office will continue supporting mandate holders as they resume their mandated activities. Special procedures are also a key actor in engaging with the UN system on human rights. The call to action provides for a renewed momentum and the necessary framework to foster the inclusion of the work of human rights mechanisms in our engagement with the UN system, including UN country teams and HRCs. Together, special procedures, treaty bodies, and the Universal Periodic Review offer a rich and complementary set of expertise and advice on which the UN, this Council, and states should capitalize in a more strategic way. There was a specific questions on how states can support special procedures' effectiveness. Constructive engagement with special procedures is critical for their effective functioning. It is therefore important that member states invite special rapporteurs to conduct country visits in full respect of the terms of reference of country visits, engage with them in substantive discussions, respond substantively to communications and recommendations contained in reports, show zero tolerance to personal attacks against mandate holders, fight reprisals against those engaging with mandate holders, provide support to very important coordination work of the Coordination Committee. Finally, it is critical to continue financially supporting the Office for it to be able to provide the necessary support to special procedures. There was a specific question on effort by the Office to ensure adherence to the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is provided by OHCHR to each mandate holder when they assume office. Mandate holders also signed the solemn declaration in Article 5 of the Code. OHCHR staff regularly draw mandate holders' attention to the responsibility under the Code. The induction sessions for new mandate holders also include detailed information on the Code. Mandate holders and the Coordination Committee operate within the framework of the Code of Conduct. General advisory procedure allows the committee to take up matters brought to its attention in relation to the Code and the Manual of Special Procedures. The President of the Human Rights Council also has the opportunity to be abreast of persistent violations of the Code.
Constant efforts are made, in particular through the work of the committee, to maintain dialogue and address concerns raised by stakeholders. This has also led to constant adjustment of the system, as I mentioned. I encourage states or others who might have concerns relating to the conduct of mandate holders to refer this to the coordination committee, so there is an opportunity for all sides to clarify any allegations relating to implementation of the codes. There was a question concerning resources available to support treaty bodies. Unfortunately, the regular budget adopted by the General Assembly for 2021 did not correct the shortfall in resources to support the human rights mechanism, and the prospect for 2022 is also quite concerning. The Secretary General, in his latest report on the status of the treaty body system, A/74/643 of January 2020, underlines that the resources dedicated to treaty bodies must be sufficiently funded in a sustainable manner from the regular budget, providing equal and optimal attention and support to all the treaty bodies in order for them to be able to fulfill their respective mandates. There was also a recommendation of the co-facilitators appointed by the General Assembly President of the 74th session. As we have seen it over the past 2 years, without the requisite resources, the treaty bodies are again falling behind in their work. I am determined not to let this essential human rights mechanism fail, but I'm hard-pressed to find the resources. With a steady increase of the individual complaints and urgent action requests submitted to the treaty bodies, the current capacity of my office to process them is far from sufficient. This situation is the consequence of the lack of sufficient staff from my office to analyze and prepare the documents for review by the committee. Consequently, while in 2012, an individual communication procedure lasted approximately 2 years, currently in most committees it may last up to 6 years. A robust and digital case management system would be crucial to facilitate the submission of documentation and exchange between the parties, to track the progress of cases and upload decisions automatically on a searchable database. The COVID-19 pandemic has presented not only challenges, but also an opportunity to find new ways to advance the work of treaty bodies online. It is clear that we need to promote the digital shift while addressing the need for simultaneous interpretation and accessibility to all state and stakeholders, including persons with disabilities. The digitalization needs of the office, including in particular the need of the treaty body system, have been put forward as part of the office's strategy in building back better. The most urgent priority remains the digital portal case management system for petitions, and I would hope that specific funding for the use of and support to this can materialize. There was a question on our work on business and human rights. Our work on business and human rights are focused on promoting implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and we promote this globally agreed framework and support states live up to their duty to protect human rights in the context of business activity and business enterprises to meet their responsibility to respect human rights. Our priority projects are focused on accountability and remedy, and now in the technology sector through our BTech project. We increasingly engage directly with companies, including at the country level, for example, through convening business peer learning workshops and through providing informal individual advice to business who approach us with human rights challenges. We are also developing strong country-level programs on business and human rights, notably in the Latin American region and soon, we hope, in Africa. We're also closely engaged with the efforts, particularly in Europe, towards mandatory human rights due diligence in line with the UN guiding principles. There have sadly been too many examples of companies disregarding the responsibility to operate with respect for human rights during the crisis. For example, civil society has documented many cases of companies refusing to pay their suppliers for orders that have been made prior to the onset of the crisis. And of course, this is obviously unacceptable. Governments can play an important role in rewarding and incentivizing responsible companies, for example, by making access to financial aid conditional on companies acting responsibly by meeting the responsibility under the UN guiding principles. It is important to support and establish creative incentives for collective action to address underlying systemic issues, including at the multilateral level. I think that the financial sector has also an essential role to play. By creating market-based incentive, it can help address the root causes of these issues and drive positive change. It is important to enhance regulatory requirements to level the playing field, which will give companies acting responsibly a competitive edge and sanction laggards. We also need to ensure that the right mix, the smart mix, of measures are in place to both incentivize and reward corporate leadership, including by the financial markets, while also building the appropriate regulatory and oversight architecture to make it more difficult to thrive at the expense of human rights. There were questions on civil society participation. And as I mentioned yesterday, it is a basic human desire to have equal opportunities to participate meaningfully in decisions that shape our lives. All governments need to create the necessary environment and put in place effective channels for the participation of all people and to ensure that those commonly excluded can also participate. This is not only because participation is a human right that must be respected, but also because it works. We know that participation produces better decisions that are owned by the public and that are sustainable in time. It allows people to say how they want to be governed. As I mentioned yesterday, this is, of course, the essence of democracy. Gender gaps on women's participation remain in all sectors because of structural barriers that reinforce discriminatory and gendered norms, practices, and policies, including the lack of political will to change power relations. These structural barriers can be removed through specific, targeted measures, including temporary special measures. Gender-balanced leadership can increase the quality of decision-making, enable half the population from being represented in decision-making spaces, and thereby ensure decision-making reflects a fuller spectrum of perspective and analysis. We will also continue to put the need to ensure access to reliable information, respect freedom of expression, and protect those who speak up at the heart of our advocacy. Censorship, repression are constant drivers of economic and political instability. We continue advocating for the respect of the right of peaceful assembly and other related human rights, and I publicly speak against illegitimate restrictions of the right, including through unnecessary or disproportionate use of force in the management of assemblies. My office regularly monitors situations where protest is taking place, produces reports with findings and recommendations which states should put in practice. We welcome the attention in this Council to the question of peaceful protest and recall that OHCHR has been mandated to organize a panel on current challenges and good practices on peaceful protest as the September 2021 session. We count with state support and participation at this event. More specifically on protection of civil society actors at risk, we need to invest in more effective protection mechanisms that take into different groups and individuals' needs and experiences. Protection networks have been found to be effective in improving the safety and security of defenders, ensuring their inclusivity and equipping them with the resources they need is a key investment in keeping defenders safe. Hand in hand with that goes the promotion of open spaces for debate and dialogue online and offline. Let me briefly touch upon some of the comments made concerning the work of my office in country-specific situations. On Western Sahara, after the breach of ceasefire in November last year, my office has continued to remotely monitor the human rights situation in Western Sahara and the Tindouf camps. Our last technical mission to the region was 6 years ago, and I reiterate my appeal to all parties to facilitate such technical missions and allow my office to have a direct and impartial understanding of the human rights situation in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2548 in 2020. But I also will appeal to the all parties to be able to agree on a special envoy, because the Secretary General has already presented a large number of possible special envoys that have not been accepted by some of the parties. I continue to follow the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. The Commission of Inquiry will play an important role in contributing towards accountability, and my office stands ready to provide it with the necessary support as mandated by the Council in the aftermath of the escalation. It is also essential to focus on rebuilding Gaza to ensure that people have homes, schools, hospitals, mental health support, stable electricity, clean water, and sanitation. In my report to the Council, Human Rights Council /43/71, concerning the database, paragraph 32, provided that a business enterprise may provide further information with respect to its involvement in the relevant activity. A number of enterprises have entered into communication with OHCHR on such issues, and to the extent possible within existing resources, the Office has made preliminary assessment of such communications. On the wider question as to future updating and publication of the database, as I indicated in my remarks to the Council in March of this year, following on my comment of last June, the issue remains of resource requirements. I observed then that it was not possible for the Office to absorb on an open-ended recurring basis into the future the substantial resources that updating the database and reporting to the Council would annually imply.
Any further work in this area can only be discharged consistent with the organization's budgetary process applicable to funding mandates of the Council, and the matter remains at that point. On China and the visit that we are doing, we have resumed not long ago discussions with China on the modality for a visit, as I mentioned yesterday in my remarks, including what could constitute a meaningful access to Xinjiang. I hope that a agreement can be reached soon to allow for such a visit to be conducted this year. In the meantime, the office continues to deepen its analysis and assessment of the alleged patterns of human rights violation in Xinjiang, and are seeking meaningful engagement with all the parts involved. And of course, we have not been silent. In every session of the Council, we have spoke about it. On Sri Lanka, I respect the fact that notwithstanding its rejection of the Human Rights Council Resolution 46/1, the government of Sri Lanka has expressed its commitment to continue cooperate with OHCHR and the Human Rights Mechanism. My report to the Human Rights Council contains a number of recommendations to the government, which should provide a starting point for further engagement with my office and the wider UN system. I would like to end by thanking all distinguished delegates, representatives of civil society, UN entities, and other stakeholders for their cooperation and constructive engagement with myself and my office. I'm fully committed to continue to work together at a time when the promotion of human rights is more relevant than ever. We are at a turning point. As the Secretary General said, we can witness a breakthrough or a breakdown, and I'm convinced that human rights are the critical cornerstone for a breakthrough towards more equal, safer, greener, and sustainable society. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her participation. And now, Excellencies, Madam High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, we will proceed with the presentation of the Secretary General's report on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, submitted pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 75/191, and the presentation of the High Commissioner's oral update on Nicaragua, submitted pursuant to Council Resolution 46/2. I would like to recall that pursuant to President's Statement PRST/OS/14/1 adopted on 7th December 2020, no general debates will take place during the Council's June session. Therefore, the reports and oral updates, which are not followed by a separate interactive dialogue during the current session, may be discussed during the relevant general debates at the 48th session. I would now like to give the floor to the High Commissioner. Madam?
Thank you, Vice President. Members of the Human Rights Council, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 75/191, the Council has presented with a report of the Secretary General concerning the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is A/HRC/47/22. It covers the period from 1st of June 2020 to 17 March 2021. Economically, the country is facing deteriorating living standards, high inflation, and widespread unemployment, fueling discontent and protest. At the political level, the authorities have shown no willingness to adopt meaningful reform. Sectorial sanctions have aggravated economic distress, and the COVID-19 pandemic has badly hurt the already strained health sector. While I reiterate our appeal to waive sanctions that could undermine Iran's capacity to respond to the pandemic, the existence of sanctions does not remove the state's responsibility to respond to the pandemic in line with human rights law, for example, providing adequate prevention and treatment measures in prisons. The Secretary General continues to be deeply concerned with widespread use of death penalty and its arbitrary imposition for a range of acts that under international law do not constitute most serious crimes. In violation of human rights law, death sentences are also frequently imposed based on forced confessions, extracted through torture, or after serious violations of the right to a fair trial. In 2020, at least 267 people, including 9 women, were executed, but only 91 of these executions were announced. So far in 2021, at least 95 people have been executed in Iran, 6 of them women. Over 80 child offenders are on death row, with at least 4 at risk of imminent execution. There has been an increase in executions for drug-related crimes, in particular of individuals from ethnic and religious minorities. Last year, at least 69 Kurdish individuals were executed, including some after convictions under vaguely defined charges, acting against national security or membership of Salafi groups. Many individuals from the Arab minority remain on death row or have been subjected to enforced disappearance following arrest. They were executed in secret on 28th of February. There also appears to be an increase in executions of members of the Baloch minority and other minority groups. The reports document additional violations faced by ethnic, religious, and other minorities. I note also that the retrial of 3 demonstrators previously sentenced to death for participating in the protests of November 2019 has yet again been postponed. Let me again emphasize my concern and that of the Secretary General regarding the use of unsubstantiated charges to condemn protesters to death. The use of inappropriate force by security forces against protesters and bystanders in November 2019, amounting to the worst incident of state violence at protests in decades. However, protesters, human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and civil society actors continue to be subjected to intimidation, arbitrary detention, and criminal persecution, including the death penalty. To date, there has been no accountability for any of the gross human rights violations committed by security forces in response to protests. Neither has there been any notable effort to address large numbers of documented cases of torture and ill treatment of children, women, and men linked to the justice system's reliance on forced confessions. In this, as in many other respects, persistent impunity for human rights violations remains a crucial concern. I also know the high number of reprisals carried out by state agents and entities against people who cooperate with the UN human rights mechanism. Regarding the continued repression of civil society activities, Iran's largest and best-known civil society group, Iman Ali's Popular Students' Relief Society, was forcibly dissolved through a court decision in March. A range of measures have undermined the independence of Iran's bar associations, and several lawyers have been charged or convicted on national security charges for participating in workshops outside Iran or simply for defending their clients. Other lawyers, as well as numerous civil society activists, have been imprisoned for advocating women's rights and an end to compulsory bailing laws. The law on preserving the dignity and protection of women against violence, which is currently before Parliament, is a step forward in criminalizing violence and sexual harassment of girls and women, but it fails to provide effective guarantees to protect women against violence or to ensure remedies. It also does not criminalize child marriage or marital rape and fails to repeal the multiple discriminatory provisions against women in Iran's civil code. Excellencies, the sentence reduction law, which entered into force last year, is a positive step and has led to the release of some imprisoned human rights offenders. Among them, the Secretary General's report welcomes the release of Narges Mohammadi, a female journalist and former deputy director of the Defenders of Human Rights Center. Regrettably, last month she was again arbitrarily convicted and was sentenced to 30 months imprisonment and 80 lashes, prohibited under humanitarian human rights law, and part of a pattern in which new charges are brought against human rights defenders and political prisoners to prevent their release or return them to prison. Just a few days ago, she was also violently attacked by apparent state security agents who warned her about her activity threatened the state and should be stopped. The report also confirms consistent testimony of mistreatment of prisoners, including widespread and extended use of solitary confinement, used as a form of punishment and to prevent information from inside the prison to reach the outside world. Excellencies, overall the report finds a disturbing human rights landscape for Iranian women and men of every religious faith, ethnic origin, social class, and other status. We regret that the framework for the right to political participation is not in line with international standards. The office stands ready to work with Iran's leadership to establish a more secure human rights foundation for the country. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you. And we shall now hear the delegations of the countries concerned. You will have 5 minutes for your statements. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran via Zoom.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran is fully committed to the protection and promotion of human rights and respects its international obligations. Just yesterday, we submitted Iran's fourth national report on the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We cannot afford to be dissuaded because of unfair pressure and baseless allegations. We urge all states to uphold the principles of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues and the elimination of double standards and politicization. We also call upon all who truly care for human rights to recognize the imperative of the rule of law and the centrality of judicial systems in preserving the rule of law and protecting human rights. Mr. President, the Iranian people have shown maximum resilience against the cruel unilateral coercive measures strategized by the Trump regime to put so-called maximum pressure on Iran as part of their obsessive addiction to unilateralism and their hostility towards Iran. The US continues to carry on with the unlawful and inhuman legacy of the former administration in defiance of international law and basic principles of humanity. We should never forget that the US even tightened its unilateral sanctions during the pandemic, leaving no doubt as to their true intention to immiserate a whole nation in bold disrespect to the ICJ's ruling of 3rd October 2018. The US and its enablers and those states that have been enforcing its unilateral coercive measures must be held to account for the massive, systematic, and gross violations of human rights. The US is allegedly one of the major advocates of this reporting scheme, and I leave it to my audience to make their judgment if an imposer of such atrocious unilateral coercive measures can logically claim to care for the human rights of the Iranians. Mr. President, the report presented today is based on an entirely political mandate initiated by a group of like-minded, or rather, similarly biased countries that have for long instrumentalized human rights as part of their adversarial agenda against Iran. The product of such prejudicial mandate is unavoidably biased towards reinforcing the prejudices. Shouldn't one consider ending this careless, vicious circle? The report is one of the 4 yearly reports, all similar in content, theme, and tone, originating from a mentality that is far from good faith, compiled inevitably to satisfy the mandate devised by a few Western states to pressurize and demonize Iran. The successive reporting instructed on the relevant UNGA resolutions tabled each year by Canada, a country that decided to sever diplomatic relations with Iran more than a decade ago for no good reason, and that persists in its policy of denying the huge Iranian diaspora of their basic consular rights, are purposely aimed at antagonizing Iran and generating negative stereotyping. The question is if and how such flawed mandate that comes from an overblown sense of self-entitlement and lacks any good faith on the part of its main sponsors could possibly contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights, other than compiling volumes of documents full of controversial and inaccurate information and false narratives. The pattern methodology used in compiling the report is impeccably based on overgeneralizing individual cases, magnifying negatives, minimizing positives, and catastrophizing the whole situation. Mr. President, despite all the misgivings, Iran, as always, didn't hesitate to try in all good faith to correct a host of disinformation, false claims, and unsubstantiated allegations mentioned in the report. We wish that Iran's responsible and professional approach would have been reciprocated by the report compilers, who instead opted to ignore the overwhelming majority of our 60 pages of comments and clarification. We also regret that the compilers continue to underestimate drastically the true negative impacts of UCMs on human rights of the Iranian. We also regret that the UN human rights mechanisms prefer to keep silent on the assassination of Iranian nationals and scientists. Mr. President, last Friday, the Iranians elected their city and town councils across Iran, as well as the 13th president of the Islamic Republic, through the ballot box, and showcased their determination to exercise their constitutional rights and secure the country's democratic processes. The Islamic Republic of Iran remains resolute in upholding human rights. We continue our interactive approach to contributing to the promotion and protection of human rights for all, including through constructive engagement with other states, the Office of the UN High Commissioner, and relevant mandate holders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. And now I will give the floor back to the High Commissioner to present her oral update on Nicaragua. Madam High Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. Muchas gracias. Excelencias, desde mi último informe sobre Nicaragua ante este Consejo el pasado 23 de febrero, mi oficina ha observado un preocupante y acelerado deterioro de la situación de derechos humanos. Esta aleja la posibilidad de que los y las nicaragüenses puedan ejercer plenamente sus derechos políticos en las elecciones del 7 de noviembre. Desde hace más de 3 años, este Consejo ha analizado en profundidad la crisis de derechos humanos, social y política que afecta a Nicaragua. Lamentablemente debo informar que no se ha dado cumplimiento a la casi totalidad de las recomendaciones formuladas por mi oficina al Estado de Nicaragua. Esta crisis no solo no presenta avisos de ser superada, sino que se ha agudizado de manera alarmante. Del 2 al 21 de junio, la Policía Nacional y el Ministerio Público detuvieron a varios miembros de la oposición. 5 personas que habían hecho pública su intención de presentarse como candidatas presidenciales, otras 5 lideresas y 3 líderes políticos y 2 dirigentes gremiales. Sus detenciones bajo conceptos penales ambiguos y sin suficiente evidencia probatoria fueron marcadas por graves violaciones de las garantías procesales. Al respecto, me preocupa especialmente la situación de las mujeres y las personas adultas mayores privadas de libertad. Estas investigaciones penales se fundamentan en 2 leyes adoptadas en julio del 2018 y en octubre del 2020 respectivamente. La ley número 977 contra el lavado de activos, el financiamiento del terrorismo, y la ley número 1055 de defensa de los derechos del pueblo a la independencia, soberanía y autodeterminación para la paz. Mi oficina y varios mecanismos especiales de este Consejo ya habían advertido que estas leyes podrían ser utilizadas para perseguir a los opositores, como en efecto está ocurriendo. Las autoridades también han empleado una reciente reforma del Código Procesal Penal para detener a la gran mayoría de las personas mencionadas hasta por 90 días, en lugar del término constitucional de 48 horas. Mientras tanto, la Fiscalía continúa las investigaciones en prejuicio de sus derechos a la libertad personal, a la presunción de inocencia y a un recurso efectivo. Esta situación les impediría competir en las elecciones generales, restringiendo no solo sus derechos políticos, sino también los derechos de los y las ciudadanas de poder votar por las opciones de su preferencia. El 4 de mayo se adoptó una ley de reforma electoral, aun cuando ella fomenta la participación política equitativa de las mujeres, hace caso omiso de las peticiones de la sociedad civil y de la comunidad internacional. No introduce salvaguardias para garantizar la imparcialidad e independencia de las autoridades electorales y limita indebidamente los derechos a la libertad de expresión, asociación, reunión pacífica y participación política. El 18 de mayo, el Consejo Supremo Electoral disolvió la personalidad jurídica de 2 partidos políticos sin que fueran oídos sus representantes. Esas son 2 decisiones que infringen los principios de legalidad, necesidad y proporcionalidad. Desde la segunda mitad de abril, con ocasión del 3er aniversario del inicio de las protestas del 2018, mi oficina registró un escalamiento de la persecución selectiva contra personas defensoras de derechos humanos, periodistas y personas percibidas como opositoras. Seguimos documentando casos de detenciones arbitrarias, agresiones y hostigamiento por parte de la Policía Nacional. Ello apunta a la represión sistemática de los intentos de víctimas y organizaciones de la sociedad civil de protestar en espacios públicos, violando así su derecho a la libertad de expresión, asociación y a la reunión pacífica. Se llegó incluso a impedir que familiares pudieran conmemorar el 3er aniversario de la muerte de sus seres queridos. Según fuentes de sociedad civil, hasta el 14 de junio, 9 mujeres y 115 hombres permanecían privados de su libertad en el contexto de la actual crisis de derechos humanos. Un número significativo de personas defensoras de derechos humanos, líderes y lideresas sociales y políticos, abogados y abogadas, estudiantes y campesinos, reportaron a mi oficina ser víctimas de un persistente hostigamiento por parte de la policía en el entorno de sus residencias o de las sedes de sus organizaciones. En varias oportunidades, la policía les impidió salir de las casas, vulnerando su derecho a la libertad de circulación. Además, en algunos casos también relataron el acoso de personas vestidas de civil. Además, se registraron declaraciones públicas de autoridades y algunos medios oficialistas, estigmatizando a las personas percibidas como opositoras. Ellos incluyen amenazas en redes sociales, y el hostigamiento contra medios y periodistas independientes, incluso a través de su involucramiento en las investigaciones penales arriba mencionadas. Las anteriores acciones en su conjunto generan un clima de temor que inhibe el ejercicio de los derechos a la libertad de reunión pacífica, asociación y expresión, los cuales resultan esenciales para garantizar un proceso electoral creíble, libre y equitativo. Asimismo, continuaron los reportes de ataques armados contra comunidades indígenas en la región autónoma Costa Caribe Norte y sobre nuevos casos de femicidio. Mi oficina sigue estrechando la coordinación con la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, CIDH, y la comunidad internacional para el monitoreo de la situación en Nicaragua. Lamentablemente, el gobierno sigue sin contestar a las comunicaciones enviadas por mi oficina. Ante este escenario, llamo al gobierno de Nicaragua a un cambio urgente en el curso de acción que está adoptando frente al proceso electoral. Ello implica como mínimo liberar de inmediato a todas las personas detenidas arbitrariamente, cesar todo acto de persecución en contra de las voces disidentes, restablecer los derechos y libertades que hacen posible un proceso electoral libre, creíble y equitativo, y derogar la legislación restrictiva del espacio cívico y democrático. Conforme al establecido en su última resolución, hago un llamado a este Consejo para que considere con urgencia todas las medidas a su alcance para fortalecer la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en Nicaragua. Ella incluye la rendición de cuentas por las graves violaciones cometidas desde abril del 2018. Asimismo, reitero que es urgente que se autorice el regreso a mi oficina a Nicaragua, así como de los demás mecanismos de derechos humanos, a fin de contribuir a superar la crisis que vive el país. Muchas gracias, vicepresidente.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nicaragua. You have the floor, sir.
El Gobierno de Reconciliación y Unidad Nacional representa en este Consejo al noble, valiente y trabajador pueblo nicaragüense con la frente en alto y el orgullo de ser protagonistas de una historia de lucha por nuestra soberanía nacional y nuestra independencia, más aún en este año bicentenario. Tenemos derecho a vivir tranquilos, tenemos derecho al respeto, tenemos derecho a la paz que con tanto empeño hemos venido construyendo entre siglos de agresión, intromisión, intervención de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica y de las potencias europeas cómplices que han pretendido mantener dominio imperialista y colonial sobre nuestra libre y soberana Nicaragua bendita. Nos presentamos ante este Consejo para ratificar el vigor, la gloria y la razón histórica del pueblo nicaragüense que se ha alzado y alza con alma de victorias frente a los agresores de siempre. Tenemos el honor de defender la patria y defender los intereses y derechos de un pueblo que camina en valores y culturas propias, un pueblo reconocido a través de los años como inspiración y ejemplo de los pueblos en lucha. En los últimos días hemos vivido y enfrentado valerosamente la misma posición intervencionista que hemos conocido y combatido desde William Walker, filibustero norteamericano, supremacista y esclavista, autoproclamado presidente de Nicaragua, y desde antes y aún después, cuando entre guerras, intervenciones y ocupaciones militares de los Estados Unidos asesinaron a nuestros generales patriotas, padres de nuestra dignidad nacional, Benjamín Celedón y Augusto Sandino, o cuando los sucesivos y guerreristas mandatarios norteamericanos se han declarado contras, sin ningún pudor y en la más cruda desvergüenza. Nicaragua ha enfrentado la codicia indecente de Estados Unidos y Europa, que se ha valido de todos los vicios de su propia decadencia para intentar desarticular y desmontar el honor nacional y el espíritu del sandinismo. Y es que la inmoral y evidente avaricia imperial, colonial, norteamericana y europea y neocolonial, con sus pretendidos destinos manifiestos, siempre ha perseguido y persigue nuestra estratégica y privilegiada posición geográfica. Los hemos enfrentado con valentía, hidalguía, sencillez, buen corazón y la valiosa experiencia de convivencia dialogante y pacífica de una cultura de reconciliación y concordia que, a pesar de tantas perversiones guerreristas, se mantiene y acrecienta entre el pueblo y el Estado nicaragüenses. Señora Presidenta, hermanas y hermanos delegados, nos presentamos a este Consejo para defender la justicia y la paz. El derecho de Nicaragua a vivir en justicia y paz, el derecho a vivir sin intromisiones extranjeras, el derecho a protagonizar nuestro destino de pueblo heroico que no se somete a las imposiciones de las potencias imperiales. Venimos a este Consejo a decir basta ya de reproducir en organismos que supuestamente deben servir para la defensa de los derechos humanos el discurso imperial e intervencionista de quienes pretenden dictar nuestras leyes, nuestras decisiones, nuestras maneras y modelos de vida, anulando nuestra soberanía, pretendiendo imponer modos ajenos a nuestra cultura e idiosincrasia en ese arrogante, soberbio e improcedente afán de dominar un país y un pueblo que solo sufrimiento y dolor debe al imperialismo y los colonialismos en todas sus formas. Señora Presidenta, hermanas y hermanos delegados, venimos a este Consejo a denunciar a los Estados Unidos y las potencias europeas que son sus cómplices y a denunciar su política inmoral e indecente de medidas agresivas, arbitrarias, ilegales, coercitivas y unilaterales que violentan todos los instrumentos del derecho internacional. Venimos a denunciar y seguiremos denunciando a la Europa colonial y a los Estados Unidos, invasor de la América nuestra, como le llamó el inmortal y universal nicaragüense Rubén Darío. Y así los denunciamos aquí hoy, como invasores, conquistadores y asaltantes del derecho, de los patrimonios y de la soberanía de los pueblos. Venimos a este Consejo a exigir justicia para Nicaragua, justicia para las familias nicaragüenses, justicia para un pueblo de fe, de valores, de ideales que no se entregan, de comunidades que, como decía nuestro general Sandino, ni se venden ni se rinden jamás. En Nicaragua, bendita, soberana y siempre libre, hay leyes. Y esas leyes se respetan. Son leyes similares o iguales a las de cualquier país del mundo, pero ellos, los imperialistas, las tienen y aplican mientras no nos reconocen a nosotros el derecho a aplicar nuestras leyes similares de defensa de la lealtad de la patria. Nos denuncian porque las personas que están respondiendo ante la justicia nicaragüense son sus tristes y fracasados asalariados, desgraciadamente vendepatrias de siempre que han cometido delitos contra la soberanía, la independencia, la seguridad y la paz en nuestra Nicaragua. Cualquier otra cosa que se diga en este Consejo es parte de la misma estrategia de difamación, de comunicación denigrante y de pretensiones de humillar sojuzgando a un país y a un pueblo que nada debe y nada teme. Venimos a denunciar, repetimos, a los imperialistas norteamericanos y europeos y sus políticas y acciones injerencistas, violatorias del derecho internacional y de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Sepan, hermanas y hermanos del mundo, que en Nicaragua hay un pueblo laborioso, digno, amoroso, solidario, fraternal e identificado con las mejores causas, las causas de la justicia, la vida verdadera y la libertad y los derechos al trabajo, la seguridad y la paz, a la salud, a la educación, a la prosperidad. Esos son los propósitos y esas son las realizaciones de nuestra Nicaragua. Avanzamos a pesar de los imperialistas de la tierra, en todas sus criminales complicidades, porque somos dignos y esforzados y porque no somos colonia de nadie, y vamos con alegría hacia el cumplimiento de los objetivos trazados por Naciones Unidas para la vida buena, justa, armoniosa, sostenible y con derecho al desarrollo para todas y para todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And now I understand that a number of delegations have requested to exercise the right of reply regarding the statements made under Agenda Item 2. I will now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iran to exercise the right of reply by video statement. I'm sorry, it's Iraq.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يمارس وفد العراق حق الرد على البيان المشترك الذي ألقاه وفد هولندا ضمن البند الثاني. السيد الرئيس، يعرب العراق عن استغرابه من استغلال مجلس حقوق الإنسان لإلقاء بيان يتناول الانتخابات العراقية المبكرة. المجلس من وجهة نظرنا معني بتعزيز واحترام حقوق الإنسان وفق مبادئ العالمية واللا انتقائية وعدم التسييس، ولا علاقة له بعملية انتخابية يجري التحضير لها وطنيا وتدعمها الأمم المتحدة والمجتمع الدولي، بل هي عملية مدعومة حتى من عواصم الدول التي ألقت البيان المشترك، حيث جدد وزراء خارجية الاتحاد الأوروبي بمن فيهم وزيرة خارجية هولندا خلال لقائهم يوم أمس مع معالي وزير خارجية العراق على دعمهم اللامشروط للعراق في إقامة الانتخابات المبكرة، وتعهدوا بإرسال مراقبين لها. وبالرغم من تضمن البيان للعديد من الإشارات الإيجابية والإشادة بدور الحكومة العراقية، إلا أنه يفتقر إلى الموضوعية بأسباب طرحه في هذا المحفل وعدم التشاور مع وفد العراق بخصوص ما ورد فيه. وبناء على ما تقدم، يرغب وفد العراق باستعراض إجراءات الحكومة العراقية واستعداداتها لإجراء الانتخابات في 10 تشرين الأول المقبل. أولاً، أكدت السلطات العراقية لأكثر من مرة التزامها التام بإجراء انتخابات عراقية مبكرة، وأقر مجلس النواب العراقي قانوناً جديداً للانتخابات يضمن نزاهتها وحريتها وشفافيتها، ويدعم عمل المفوضية العليا المستقلة للانتخابات من أجل تمثيل إرادة الناخب العراقي والارتقاء بالعملية الديمقراطية. ثانياً، طلبت الحكومة العراقية من مجلس الأمن مراقبة الانتخابات، وتكللت الجهود بإصدار مجلس الأمن قراره المرقم 2576 لإرسال فريق للأمم المتحدة لمراقبة الانتخابات. وكذلك طلب العراق من جامعة الدول العربية والمجتمع الدولي القيام بالأمر ذاته. ثالثاً، إن قرار مجلس الأمن أعلاه طلب من الدول دعم العراق لإجراء انتخاباته المبكرة وعدم التدخل بها، وإن إثارة الموضوع في مجلس حقوق الإنسان يعد سابقة خطيرة للتدخل في الإرادة الديمقراطية للمواطن العراقي. رابعاً، الانتخابات هي عملية عراقية خالصة تحرص حكومة بلدي على توفير الأجواء الهادئة لها وحث الناخب على المشاركة فيها، حيث تشهد الأجواء الديمقراطية منافسة بين 44 تحالفاً و256 حزباً. ختاماً، يدعو العراق الدول المقدمة للبيان المشترك إلى توخي الدقة وعدم تسييس المجلس وعدم التدخل في عملية انتخابية عراقية خالصة. وشكراً السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. The next speaker to exercise the right of reply is Sri Lanka, and you have the floor for 3 minutes. Sri Lanka, do we have you? Yeah. Could you please unmute Sri Lanka? Could you unmute yourself? Technical problem? Yeah. We don't hear you. We'll come back to Sri Lanka a bit later, and now we move to the next speaker to exercise the right of reply. This is Morocco by video statement.
Madame la Présidente, ma délégation exerce son droit de réponse à la déclaration hostile à mon pays prononcée au nom d'un groupuscule de pays conduit par l'Algérie et qui, comme à son habitude, prend en otage les travaux de notre Conseil en instrumentalisant la question du Sahara marocain en dehors de l'unique cadre dans lequel elle est traitée, à savoir le Conseil de sécurité. De même, ma délégation ne peut dissimuler sa stupéfaction quant à cette déclaration, triste œuvre du représentant de l'Algérie dont le régime soutient, arme et finance le groupe séparatiste armé du Polisario dans l'unique objectif de porter atteinte à l'intégrité territoriale du Maroc. Les derniers développements les concernant ont démontré que cette bande est à l'image de son prétendu chef qui est poursuivi dans un pays membre de l'Union européenne pour des crimes de viol, de séquestration, de torture et d'exécution et par-dessus le marché l'usurpation d'identité. S'agissant des allégations des ruptures des cessez-le-feu, la question concerne davantage la partie qui le revendique, à savoir le groupe séparatiste. Pour ma délégation, l'évidence de cet acte est claire. Détourner le processus politique de la voie positive et continue de reconnaissance de la marocanité du Sahara par un très grand nombre de pays de par le monde. Nulle des déclarations et agitations médiatiques n'a affecté d'une quelconque manière les paramètres de solution politique définis par le Conseil de sécurité. Il n'y a donc de rupture de cessez-le-feu que dans l'esprit de ceux qui le préconisent en appelant à la guerre et aux affrontements militaires pour couvrir leurs échecs. Il relève du ridicule de prétendre attribuer aux provinces du Sud sud du Maroc une situation particulière des droits de l'homme pour l'absence d'éléments ou d'événements allant dans le sens de ces allégations. Aucune instance internationale, ni même la MINURSO, qui est sur place, n'ont indiqué l'existence de supposées violations des droits de l'homme. Tout simplement parce que la situation est parfaitement normale et que la population locale, comme sur l'ensemble du territoire marocain, jouit de l'ensemble de ses droits. Les quelques délégations isolées qui véhiculent ces allégations n'ont aucune légitimité à parler du respect des droits de l'homme. Ces pays devraient avoir honte de vouloir s'attaquer au Maroc alors même qu'ils font l'objet d'examens lors de la présente session, ainsi que de démarches multiples pour les violations massives qu'ils commettent à l'endroit de leur population. Mon pays accorde la liberté d'expression et de circulation à quelques séparatistes présents sur son territoire, ce que le régime algérien ne permet pas aux membres du Polisario et encore moins à ses détracteurs sur le plan national. Aussi, le territoire du Sahara marocain est ouvert à toutes les visites de délégations officielles, de représentants des médias internationaux et de l'ensemble des procédures spéciales relevant du Conseil des droits de l'homme qui apprécient de visu le niveau de développement des provinces marocaines sur tous les plans. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Merci. The next speaker to exercise the right for reply for 3 minutes is China.
副主席先生，加拿大、美国、英国、澳大利亚、欧盟和有关非政府组织出于政治目的，散布虚假信息和谎言，蓄意抹黑攻击中国，干涉中国内政，中方坚决反对。加拿大等国挑起对抗，严重违反联合国宪章宗旨和原则，严重破坏国际人权合作，国际社会应共同反对。中国政府始终秉持以人民为中心的理念，始终将人民对美好生活的向往作为奋斗目标。当前新疆社会安宁稳定，经济繁荣发展，人民安居乐业。某些国家不择手段编造关于新疆的谎言，妄图抹黑中国形象，干涉中国内政，遏制中国发展，这样的恶劣行径必将遭到国际社会唾弃。我们欢迎人权高专访华并参访新疆，但此访应该是促进交流与合作的友好访问，不是进行有罪推定式的所谓调查。香港国安法实施后，香港实现由乱及治的重大转折，香港民众的各项合法权利和自由在安全环境下得到更好行使。西藏经济蓬勃发展，社会和谐稳定，文化繁荣发展，各族人民各项权利得到充分尊重和保障。90多国以共同发言、单独发言、致函等形式支持中国的正义立场，这充分说明公道自在人心。任何借人权问题抹黑和诋毁中国的行为注定失败。加拿大等西方国家至今仍存在殖民主义的迷梦中，摆出一副教师爷的面孔，他们自己的人权状况触目惊心。国内种族歧视、贫富悬殊、警察暴力等问题根深蒂固。有的国家还四处挑起战争，造成大量平民伤亡。这些国家应以实际行动解决自己的人权问题，而不是对别国指手画脚。新疆、香港、西藏事务纯属中国内政，不容任何外部势力干涉。中方将坚决捍卫国家主权、安全和发展利益。我们敦促有关国家停止借口人权问题搞政治操弄。中方不会坐视国家利益和尊严受到侵犯。谢谢副主席先生。
We now turn back to Sri Lanka for the right of reply. Do we have Sri Lanka?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We exercise this right of reply in response to references to Sri Lanka made by the United Kingdom and other speakers during this interactive dialogue. The proscribed groups referred to in these interventions include organizations linked to the LTTE and other international terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their regional and Sri Lankan affiliates. They have been listed under the relevant domestic regulations as a part of Sri Lanka's obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 1373, which has been in operation for almost a decade. The list is based on cogent evidence. It is misleading and unwarranted to characterize action to prevent financing of terrorism and violent extremism as targeting of any particular community or as a hindrance to reconciliation. Sri Lanka experienced the Easter Sunday suicide bombings in April 2019, which is by far the biggest terrorist attack on a civilian target to take place anywhere in the world. Measures taken by Sri Lanka to prevent the recurrence of such terrorist attacks have been taken in the interest of public security and in accordance with the recommendations of the Parliamentary Sectoral Oversight Committee on National Security of 2019-2020. This was a unique national effort which had the participation of parliamentarians of both the then government and opposition, representing all ethnic and religious communities in the country. Sri Lanka continues to cooperate with foreign intelligence services, including those of the OIC countries, to combat cross-border terrorism. Some of the perpetrators of these acts of terrorism have already been charged outside Sri Lanka. What the Human Rights High Commissioner has referred to as provisions in the law that permit arbitrary and administrative detention of people are essentially the same legal provisions that were applied to rehabilitate and release into society nearly 12,000 Tamil Tiger cadres instead of prosecuting them for terrorist offences after the war ended in 2009. These rehabilitated former LTT cadres have reintegrated into society. This has been one of the most successful terrorist rehabilitation programs in the world, a fact acknowledged even by the then UN Human Rights High Commissioner in 2013. It is regrettable that Sri Lanka's successful efforts are being subject to unjustifiable criticism. It is regretted that certain speakers seek to highlight perceived notions of targeting particular communities, including in the context of commemoration events. The Global Threat Forecast 2021 of the UN Threat and Risk Assessment Service states, quote, LTT ideology and doctrine are still upheld as romantic and attractive among the younger generation. The UN Security Council Resolution 1624 condemns in the strongest terms the incitement of terrorist acts and repudiate attempts at the justification or glorification of terrorist attacks that may incite further terrorist attacks, and calls upon all states to adopt such measures as may be necessary and appropriate to prohibit such incitement. Against this backdrop, we deplored attempts by certain countries to misrepresent legitimate action taken by Sri Lanka to protect its people as targeting or discriminating against any particular community. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. The next speaker is Colombia. You have the floor for 3 minutes. Do we have Colombia?
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. En la respuesta manifestada por algunas de las delegaciones, en la preocupación manifestada por las delegaciones de Suiza, Bélgica y una organización de la sociedad civil ante este Consejo por eventos relacionados con el paro nacional, me permito anotar que desde el 28 de abril han tenido lugar más de 10.000 manifestaciones en diferentes ciudades del país, en las que muchos ciudadanos han ejercido libremente su derecho a la protesta pacífica. Esto solo ocurre en un país donde existe vigencia de los derechos fundamentales como la libertad de expresión, de asociación y de reunión en una democracia como Colombia. Desafortunadamente, aproximadamente un 10% de esos actos de protesta pacífica registraron actos de violencia y vandalismo que, como en cualquier país del mundo, obligaron a la intervención de la fuerza pública. El Estatuto de Reacción, Uso y Verificación de la Fuerza Legítima del Estado y Protección del Derecho a la Protesta Pacífica observa la jurisprudencia nacional y los estándares internacionales, enmarcando las acciones de la Policía Nacional en el respeto a los derechos humanos. El presidente de la República ha sido enfático en que el gobierno de Colombia tiene cero tolerancia con cualquier vulneración de los derechos humanos que pueda ser atribuible a un integrante de la fuerza pública. Todas las denuncias que se han presentado en tal sentido son objeto de investigación por parte de la Fiscalía General de la Nación y la Procuraduría. A la fecha, se han priorizado las investigaciones de 178 casos. Los bloqueos que ponen en riesgo el derecho a la salud, el derecho a la alimentación y el derecho a la vida de los ciudadanos no pueden ser considerados como manifestaciones de protesta pacífica. Colombia reafirma su apertura al escrutinio internacional. La Organización de las Naciones Unidas, incluyendo la representación de la Alta Comisionada para los Derechos Humanos en Colombia y la MAP-OEA, han prestado apoyo y acompañamiento al gobierno nacional, a los organismos de control y a las autoridades locales en el seguimiento, vigilancia y atención a los hechos que se han presentado en el marco del paro nacional. Las actuales protestas no tienen nada que ver con la implementación de los acuerdos de paz, en cuya implementación está comprometido el gobierno nacional y cuya implementación es verificada por una misión del Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas. Recientemente la CIDH visitó Colombia, mantuvo un diálogo franco y fluido con el gobierno y los sectores interesados y recibió información detallada de las acciones del gobierno y pudo constatar los mecanismos implementados para avanzar en las investigaciones por denuncias de violaciones a los derechos humanos ocurridas en el marco de las manifestaciones. El gobierno de Colombia reafirma su total disposición al diálogo con todos los sectores y para atender las demandas legítimas de la población en el marco de la legalidad y el respeto a la Constitución y la ley. Las Naciones Unidas y la Iglesia Católica acompañan el proceso y son testigos de la voluntad de diálogo del gobierno. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The DPRK delegation exercised the right of reply to remarks by the United States, Germany, and Japan. The allegations on the DPRK are politically motivated in pursuit of the despicable purposes and represent the arrogant and self-righteous sophistry, having no relevance at all with genuine promotion and protection of human rights. Therefore, we categorically reject those accusations. In fact, the United States and Germany, with the worst record human rights violations, are not in a position to talk about other human rights. It is none other than these countries' tundra of human rights, where widespread of systematic human rights violations such as racial discrimination, social inequalities, police brutality, and gun-related crimes, arbitrary detention and torture, human trafficking, and sexual violence are rampant. It is preposterous that such worst human rights abusers behave themselves as human rights judges and criticize other countries. The United States and Germany are advised to clean up their human rights abuse trash before meddling in others. Let me turn to abduction issues repeated by Japan. My delegation makes it clear once again that the abduction issue has been already settled in a complete and irreversible manner. It is none other than the DPRK who is the real victim of the abduction. As attested by history, Japan is the world #1 abductor state, as it committed heinous crimes against humanity in the past, which includes forcibly abducting and drafting more than 8.4 million Koreans and forcing 200,000 Korean women in sexual slavery for Imperial Japanese Army. However, Japan has refused to acknowledge their past crimes and to make sincere apology and compensation to the victims. Japan is once again strongly urged to end useless international community and sincerely reflect on the past crimes against humanity and make due apology and reparation. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next to exercise the right of reply is India by video statement, to be followed by Armenia.
Madam President, we exercise the right of reply to the statement made by Pakistan at the interactive dialogue on the annual report of the High Commissioner. It is regrettable that Pakistan has once again misused this platform for making unfounded and irresponsible allegations against India. Pakistan has been doing this only to distract the Council's attention from the deplorable human rights situation in Pakistan. The plight of minorities in Pakistan is evident from their shrinking size. Forced conversions have become a daily phenomenon in Pakistan. We have seen reports of minor girls belonging to religious minorities being abducted, raped, forcibly converted, and married. More than 1,000 girls belonging to religious minorities are forcibly converted in Pakistan every year. Systemic persecution of minorities, including Christians, Ahmadiyya, Sikhs, Hindus through draconian blasphemy laws, forced conversions and marriages, and extrajudicial killings has become a regular phenomenon in Pakistan. Holy and ancient sites of religious minorities in Pakistan have been attacked and vandalized. Pakistan has also become the land of enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary detentions of political activists, students, journalists, human rights defenders, and minorities. Pakistan has a dubious distinction of being listed as one of the most dangerous countries for practice of journalism. Journalists are threatened, intimidated, taken off air, kidnapped, and in some cases killed, mainly to silence critics of the establishment. While families of victims continue to struggle for justice, the perpetrators of these acts have enjoyed complete impunity. Madam President, the scourge of terrorism is the gravest violation of human rights and must be dealt with in strongest terms in all its forms and manifestations. Pakistan, as its state policy, continues to provide pensions to dreaded and listed terrorists and hosts them on its territory. It is high time that Pakistan is held accountable for aiding and abetting terrorism. I thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to Armenia for 3 minutes, to be followed by Turkey. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. My delegation asked for the floor to express its dismay at the pattern of abuses of this August Council exerted by Azerbaijan, which consistently put forward biased, politically motivated allegations against my country that are far from the agenda, mandate, and the spirit of the HRC. Azerbaijan tries to mislead the international community by distorting the root causes of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and the recent hostilities it initiated with an intention to annihilate the Armenian population. First, snap parliamentary elections were conducted in Armenia 2 days ago. The ruling party of Armenia will remain in office with around 54% of the votes. Second, the international observers, including from the ODIHR, concluded that the elections were competitive and well managed. The election administration conducted its work in a transparent, professional manner and enjoyed electoral stakeholders' confidence. Voters were provided with a broad range of options and fundamental rights and freedoms were respected, with contestants being able to campaign freely. Election day, including the vote count, was also assessed positively. Third, in a stark contrast to the last elections in Azerbaijan, were clarified by the same specialized international agency in the following terms, and I quote, "The restrictive legislation and political environment prevented genuine competition. Some prospective candidates were denied the right to stand. Voters were not provided with a meaningful choice due to lack of real political discussion. Instances of pressure on voters, candidates, and their representatives were observed. Significant procedural violations during counting and the tabulation raised concern whether the results were established honestly." End of quote. Hence, the exploitation of the HRC platform by Azerbaijan does not come as a surprise for us. Azerbaijan is far from being a state that strives at contributing to promote the human rights. On the contrary, it is an authoritarian country that tries to conceal its malpractices and breaches of fundamental freedoms and gross violations of human rights. Azerbaijan invented the notorious practices of laundromat and caviar diplomacy that since then have been inscribed among the list of most egregious cases of corruption and embezzlement. Azerbaijan refers to its opposition as a fifth column, abducts and attacks its critics abroad, blatantly falsifies elections, and keeps dissenting voices behind the bars. Hardly such a country can preach about human rights at this council. I thank you.
Thank you. Next is Turkey, to be followed by Israel. Turkey, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to exercise our right of reply to the comments of the EU delegation, Greece, Austria, and Iceland. The Human Rights Action Plan of Turkey constitutes an important component of our reform agenda. It is designed as a comprehensive plan to enhance all aspects of human rights with a view to strengthening the protection of human rights, improving the rule of law, and the independence and effectiveness of the judiciary. A detailed implementation schedule of the action plan was published on 13th of April this year. 2 years after the publication of the judicial reform strategy, the Human Rights Action Plan is a further indication of Turkey's unwavering resolve for reform. On the other hand, Turkey has always stood by women on the advancement of their rights, the strengthening of their role within society, and their protection against violence. We have supported the efforts of the international community to protect and promote women's rights, both in terms of legislative framework and in practice. The withdrawal of Turkey from the Istanbul Convention should not be interpreted as a step back in fighting violence against women. Women's rights are guaranteed in the national legislation with the most advanced norms. Last but not least, we call on Austria to increase efforts to eradicate Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred incidents and stop stigmatizing Muslims. I thank you.
Thank you. And next is Israel, to be followed by Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I would like to exercise Israel's right of reply against the statement made by the Palestinian representative. During her statement, she said that the Palestinian Authority continues to choose the legal and peaceful path to defend their rights. Mr. Vice President, in May, over 11 days, Palestinian groups fired 4,300 rockets at Israel. These rockets were launched from built-up, densely populated areas in Gaza, using Palestinian civilians as human shields. Let me ask this Council, is this the legal and peaceful path? Mr. Vice President, if the PA truly wants to choose such a path, I would recommend they publicly condemn all terrorist acts that have been carried out against Israel. I would recommend that they publicly condemn the indiscriminate firing of rockets at Israeli civilians. I would recommend that instead of Jibril Rajoub, the Secretary General of Fatah, saying, and I quote, "We salute every form of resistance that took place," end quote, he should instead condemn violence. Mr. Vice President, the delegate referred to the flag march, which took place on June 15th, and certain chants that were made. Our Foreign Minister did condemn the language used by a minority during this march. He said, and I quote, "The fact that there are extremists for whom the Israeli flag represents hate and racism is abominable and intolerable. It is incomprehensible how one can hold an Israeli flag in one's hand and shout death to Arabs at the same time," end of quote. So while the PA continues to support genocidal language used by Palestinian extremists, our Foreign Minister condemned them resolutely. Mr. Vice President, the PA wants to turn this council into a forum to deal with bilateral issues. During her statement, the delegate said there was inaction by the international community, as if the special session, 5 resolutions, 2 items, 7 general debates, an idea with a special rapporteur with a never-ending mandate, an idea with the High Commissioner, and an update on this why this year alone is not enough to deal with the issue. Mr. Vice President, it is time for the PA to stop hijacking this council to pursue political point scoring. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Algeria, to be followed by Cambodia.
Monsieur le Président, dans un livre paru à l'Université de Columbia il y a quelques semaines, l'ancien secrétaire général des Nations Unies, M. Ban Ki-moon, a exprimé ses regrets que l'Organisation des Nations Unies ne se soit pas acquittée de son mandat en ce qui concerne le peuple du Sahara occidental. Il a indiqué que sa visite dans les camps des réfugiés le 5 mars 2016 lui a permis de se rendre compte in situ du drame induit par ce conflit oublié et dont la résolution a toujours été entravée par la puissance occupante, le Royaume du Maroc. Ce sont les propos du secrétaire général et le livre mémoire est aujourd'hui disponible. Le secrétaire général a poursuivi que suite à cette déclaration, le Royaume du Maroc a arrêté le financement des opérations de maintien de la paix et a mobilisé 1 million de personnes pour s'attaquer à sa personne. Et le Royaume du Maroc a dépêché à New York le 15 mars 2016 son ministre des Affaires étrangères pour exiger de lui qu'il présente des excuses au roi du Maroc, ce que M. Ban Ki-moon a refusé. Voilà la véritable nature, le véritable visage du Royaume du Maroc et l'insolence avec laquelle il interagit avec notre organisation. L'attitude outrancière qu'il a manifestée à l'endroit du plus haut fonctionnaire des Nations Unies. Alors ces incessantes, répétitives et outrageantes attaques contre mon pays n'entraveront pas sa détermination à continuer avec d'autres à manifester sa solidarité avec les peuples en lutte pour leur paix, pour la liberté et pour la dignité. La théâtralisation et les effets de manche de la délégation marocaine, ainsi que les contre-feux que le Royaume allume au niveau de notre Conseil, visent en fait à éloigner toute évocation et toute référence à la question de l'exercice par le peuple sahraoui de son droit à l'autodétermination. Et je me félicite que Madame le Haut-Commissaire ait fait part de son opinion et de son appel quant à la réactivation des visites dans les territoires occupés. Wikileaks et le lanceur d'alerte Coleman ont mis en lumière les procédés corruptifs au niveau des institutions et des organisations de la Genève internationale, et à ce titre, ils sont affligeants. Nous y reviendrons. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. The next speaker is Cambodia, to be followed by Belarus. Cambodia has the floor for 3 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, my delegation would like to exercise the right reply to that of Luxembourg, who took their eyes off their bigger pictures as to the nature of Cambodia raised to the COVID-19 pandemic. Across the world, the handling of this health crisis requires extraordinary and unprecedented measures, taking into account national circumstances. As for Cambodia, our response is integrate human rights values and leave no one behind. We invite the said delegation to refer to our statements delivered over the past 2 days in this HRC 47, featuring Cambodia's social protection schemes for the vulnerable groups, free national inauguration rollout, and effort to advance freedom of expression and media during the pandemic. While calling for the said delegation to assess information with rigor, non-selective, and depoliticized lens, we take this opportunity to state further facts about Cambodia as follows. First, all legislation pertaining to the COVID-19 adhere to the principle of legality, necessity, and proportionality. The COVID-19 prevention law does not aim to castigate but share the life of citizens and encourage responsible participation of everyone in the pursuit of securing public health and preserve lives. The punitive measures only target the rule breakers, causing community transmission depending on the offense and the intent behind it. Second, a series of legislative and administrative moves that Cambodia has taken were lauded by the WHO on the ground. Only full and effective enforcement of all combined health, administrative, and other actions is critical to secure life-saving, public health safety, and early return to new normal life. Third, Cambodia cherishes professional journalists who neither breach the rights of others nor twist the facts. Freedom of expression must not be upgraded to freedom to spread fake news or to incite hatred and violence. Secretary General Guterres cautioned that fake news and hate speech constitute an attack on the essence of human rights norms and principles. Fourth, open political space continue to prevail. 24 former politicians who had their political rights reinstated have joined prevailing parties or created new ones to readily challenge the ruling party through elections in the coming years. To conclude, my delegation notes that a human rights preacher always has flawed rights record at home, namely discrimination linked to sexual orientation, restricted flow of information to journalists, just to name a few. Advancement of all rights and fundamental freedom is our shared ultimate goal. That is the top of the mountain. Each and every country must be entitled to choose their own path and priorities toward the said destination. Weaponizing human rights to score political points should be avoided if we are to uphold the highest integrity and credibility of this August Council. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. The next speaker is Belarus, to be followed by Pakistan. You have the floor, Belarus.
Добрый день. В связи с заявлениями делегации Европейского Союза и США о посадке самолета Ryanair в национальном аэропорту Минск заявляем следующее. Утверждение политиков этих государств о том, что транзитный рейс посажен в Беларуси принудительно или путем обмана, не имеют под собой никаких фактических и тем более правовых оснований. Пилот принимал решение самостоятельно. Как сообщается, ИКАО ведет соответствующее расследование. Беларусь также ведет свое расследование. На этом фоне уже месяц нет никакой публичной информации от авиационных властей страны регистрации самолета Польши. В частности, нет данных о записях черных ящиков. Нет никакой информации от авиационных властей и полиции страны, места назначения рейса Литвы. В конце концов, нет никаких данных об опросе пилота. Стоит ли говорить, что нет никакой реакции от вовлеченных сторон на официальные запросы Беларуси о правовой помощи? Молчание этих игроков, и особенно экипажа, в течение столь длительного времени является красноречивым подтверждением того, что версия принудительной посадки самолета является очередной пробиркой Пауэлла с зубным порошком и не имеет под собой никаких оснований. Можно только представить, как развивались бы СМИ, если бы пилоты самолета рассказывали с телеэкрана о том, как белорусский МиГ помахал им крыльями. Важно ясно понимать, что обвинения в адрес Беларуси использованы правительствами США и Европейского Союза как политический предлог для продолжения очернения белорусских властей, для демонстрации их собственным избирателям того, как рьяно западные политики борются за права человека. При этом без всяких юридических оснований эти голословные обвинения использованы Евросоюзом и США для введения против народа Беларуси очередного пакета односторонних санкций, нарушающих международное право. В частности, введенные Евросоюзом запреты на полеты в небе Беларуси и на полеты белорусской гражданской авиакомпании в страны ЕС в самом начале отпускного сезона напрямую нарушили право на свободу передвижения десятков тысяч граждан и Беларуси, и стран ЕС. Однако данное обстоятельство не имеет для Запада никакого значения, ведь главной целью этих шагов было вызвать внутреннее недовольство в стране против ее правительства. В завершение два слова в отношении арестов гражданина Беларуси Протасевича и гражданки России Сапега, задержанных правоохранительными органами Беларуси в столице Беларуси на основании законных решений и обоснованных подозрений в совершении конкретных преступлений. Республика Беларусь является независимым и суверенным государством, обладает полнотой юрисдикции в отношении любых физических лиц, находящихся на ее территории. Благодарю за внимание.
The next speaker to exercise the right of reply is Pakistan, to be followed by Japan. Pakistan, you have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the Indian representative in his right of reply has resorted to a diversionary litany of lies, disinformation, and baseless allegations to obscure and obfuscate his country's atrocities in illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as well as on his own sovereign territory. Pakistan's statement had only echoed the numerous public warnings issued by the UN human rights machinery, world parliaments, independent human rights organizations, and global media with regards to India's shameful human rights record. In a series of joint letters, the leading UN special procedures have documented in harrowing details India's systematic repression of Kashmiri human rights activists daring dissent against its illegal demographic engineering of the occupied territory. To quote one example, in a recent letter, UN experts have raised alarms on how Kashmiri activist Mr. Wahid Para was tortured by Indian forces. He was deprived of sleep, stripped naked, and hung upside down in a dark underground cell. His only crime was spotlighting India's human rights crimes against Kashmiri people with the UN institutions. Such horrendous incidents are not isolated. They represent a systematic pattern of India's brutalization of Kashmiri people through state-led repression, draconian laws, and wholesale lockdowns of the occupied territory. No amount of guided tours and self-serving narrative of normalcy can alter these hard facts. Instead of introspection, India continues with its signature state-directed disinformation campaign against Pakistan while muzzling human rights defenders and bullying civil society actors. The independent EU Disinfo Lab has exposed in detail India's state-sponsored global disinformation campaign against my country, including at this very council. The truth remains, Mr. Vice President, that Mr. Modi's India today is a complete hellscape for human rights, rule of law, and democracy. We need to look no further than the Delhi pogrom of last year for confirmation of this sad reality. This senseless violence perpetrated against Muslims over the course of 3 days with full connivance of state machinery was planned by the Hindutva clique in order to teach the traitors a lesson. Many Muslims were killed, their homes burnt, their properties looted, and their worship places desecrated with complete impunity. The Delhi carnage has once again exposed that hatred, exclusion, and violence against minorities are deep-seated in the DNA of Indian state. The prodigies of RSS, the dangerous trio of Narendra Modi, Amit Shah, and Yogi Adityanath have their hands stained with blood of innocent people from Gujarat in 2002 to Delhi in 2020. Pakistan therefore reiterates its call for initiating global scrutiny and accountability of India for widely documented atrocities in illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and also in order to protect basic rights of minorities and marginalized communities in India. I thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Japan. You have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to exercise the right of reply in response to the statement made by the representative of the DPRK. The claims and figures that the DPRK mentioned regarding Japan are based on factual errors and groundless. We would like to stress that having humbly accepted the facts of history, Japan has consistently respected democracy and human rights and contributed to peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and in the international community over the past 70 years since the end of World War II. On the issues of abductions, the claims by DPRK are based on erroneous recognitions. Under the Stockholm Agreement of May 2014, notwithstanding its position, DPRK promised to carry out comprehensive and thorough investigations on all Japanese nationals concerned, including the abductees. We urge DPRK to implement the agreement and return all the abductees to Japan as quickly as possible. The victims and their families are now well advanced in age. In February 2020, Arimoto Kayoko, mother of the victim, Arimoto Keiko, passed away. In June 2020, Mr. Yokota Shigeru, father of Yokota Megumi, also passed away. The issue of abductions must be resolved without further delay. It is imperative to overcome mutual mistrust and deepen coordination between Japan and DPRK so as to realize true peace in Northeast Asia. We call on all stakeholders to share this approach and to work together for a bright future. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. This was the last speaker on the list of delegations having requested to exercise their right of reply. Are there any further requests for the exercise of the first right of reply? This seems not to be the case. And it has been brought to my attention that the distinguished representative of Morocco has requested a second right of reply, as well as the representative of DPRK. First, Morocco. Vous avez la parole, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Vice-président. En réponse au représentant de l'Algérie qui s'est rabaissé en impliquant un ancien secrétaire général des Nations Unies dans ces manipulations, je voudrais dire au représentant de l'Algérie qu'il peut s'octroyer le loisir de parler. Rien n'empêchera les observateurs honnêtes et impartiaux de dénoncer le complot mené par le régime algérien depuis un demi-siècle, non seulement contre mon pays, mais contre toute notre région, et dans l'irrespect des principes de paix et de sécurité. Le représentant de l'Algérie devrait s'interroger sur les responsabilités des gouvernants de son pays, qui doivent d'abord reconnaître que leur propre libération du colonialisme s'est faite grâce au concours historique du Maroc, qui en contrepartie continuent de faire face à leur ingratitude, imprégnés qu'ils sont par leurs pratiques absolutistes en contradiction avec les droits de l'homme. Quant aux références aux commentaires de Madame la Haute Commissaire, j'invite le représentant de l'Algérie à qu'il doit d'abord se féliciter du fait qu'elle interroge ses gouvernants sur les violations pratiquées de façon massive à l'endroit des citoyens de son propre pays, violations jalonnées par des milliers de cas qui demeurent en suspens et inquiètent et interrogent les multiples procédures spéciales de notre Conseil, comme cela est bien connu, et qui ne trouvent aucune réponse de la part des autorités algériennes. Alors, avant que Monsieur le représentant de l'Algérie commence à faire la leçon en matière des droits de l'homme, il devrait d'abord balayer devant sa propre porte, et je le tranquillise sur la situation tout à fait normale, voire même exemplaire, qui se produit non seulement dans les provinces du Sud, mais dans l'ensemble du royaume du Maroc. Je regrette fortement que cette enceinte soit manipulée jusqu'à ce point, et je prends à témoin toutes les délégations par rapport à ce genre de comportement qui ne mène à rien et qui demeurera sans issue. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Vice-président.
Merci, Excellence. I now give the floor to DPRK to exercise the second right of reply for 2 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The DPRK delegation exercised the second right of reply against Japan. It should be underlined that it is deep-seated evil habit, peculiar only to Japan, a war criminal and abductor state, who denies and refuses even ground of its gravest crimes against humanity. Japan's real intention behind making noise about already settled abduction issue is to evade the settlement of past by highlighting more abduction issue than its heinous crimes. History can never be written off or avoid. The liquidation of past crimes is the unavoidable legal and moral obligation of Japan and strong demand of the international community. Japan can never evade its historical, legal, and moral responsibility for its crimes. We reiterate that there is no statute or limitations for crimes against humanity committed by Japan in the past, and that those crimes should be held accountable. Furthermore, it should be kept in mind that international fight to end the sexual violation against women is intended to prevent the recurrence of such heinous human rights violations as the crimes of sexual slavery. Japan had better abandon its bad habit of finding fault with others and give priority to the liquidation of its past crimes against humanity, including the sexual slavery, thus demonstrating its sincerity by action. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina for 2 minutes to exercise second right of reply. I'm sorry, it's Algeria. Argentina or Algeria? Algeria. L'Algérie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Royaume du Maroc ne semble pas mesurer la profondeur de la rénovation politique et institutionnelle de l'Algérie et fait l'éloge du Royaume où, semble-t-il, il aurait atteint des performances démocratiques. En fait, son inquiétude ne traduit-elle pas la peur d'une contagion qui serait portée par le Hirak marocain sous embargo répressif et médiatique, et cela depuis 2011. Le plénipotentiaire qui a parlé hier et à 2 reprises aujourd'hui de la gestion du phénomène migratoire de mon pays devrait s'expliquer sur les encouragements que son gouvernement a prodigués aux 8000 migrants, pour la plupart mineurs, afin qu'ils envahissent le 18 mai 2021 les enclaves espagnoles de Ceuta et Melilla et par conséquent violent l'intégrité du territoire de l'Union européenne. Et cela dans la continuité de la traditionnelle politique de chantage à l'endroit du Royaume d'Espagne afin qu'il s'aligne sur ses thèses colonialistes au sujet du territoire non autonome du Sahara occidental. Enfin, quant à la légitimité évoquée des institutions qu'il a soulignées, j'aimerais qu'il nous explique par quel artifice constitutionnel le chef de l'exécutif qui préside le Conseil des ministres dans son pays ne peut pas rendre compte et présenter de bilan au Parlement, comme dans toute société fondée sur la redevabilité, à moins que ce dernier, je parle du Parlement, ne serve que de galerie pour la photo et de vitrine de contrefaçon démocratique. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, il y a une dizaine de jours, le Royaume du Maroc a adressé une lettre aux États membres du Conseil dans laquelle il faisait part des attaques de mon pays. Mais qui a commencé les attaques pendant cette session? Hier et à 3 reprises aujourd'hui, c'est bien le Royaume, mais qui se présente finalement comme une victime. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Merci. The next speaker to exercise the right of reply is Japan for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation would like to exercise the second right of reply in response to the statement made by the representative of DPRK. I will not repeat here what I said. Having humbly accepted the facts of history, Japan has sincerely addressed various issues over the past 70 years since the end of the Second World War II. Having served as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council 11 times over the past 65 years since Japan joined the United Nations, Japan has actively contributed to international peace and security. We have the term sexual slavery. The position of Japan is that the term does not reflect the facts and therefore should not be used. We reiterate that it is imperative to overcome mutual mistrust and deepen coordination between Japan and DPRK so as to realize true peace in Northeast Asia We call on all stakeholders to share this approach and to work together for a bright future. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And this was the last speaker on my list to exercise the second right of reply. Are there any further requests for second right of reply? I understand that this is not the case. And this brings us to the next item on our agenda. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I now declare open agenda item 3 entitled Promotion and Protection of All Human Rights, Civil, Political, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, including the right to development. We shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on adequate housing as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living and on the right to non-discrimination in this context. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Balakrishnan Rajagopal. You have the floor, sir.
Honorable Vice President, distinguished delegates, representatives from civil society organizations and UN entities. I thank the President of the Human Rights Council for postponing my interactive dialogue to this session due to health reasons. My apologies as well due to this reason that it was not possible to translate the report in all UN languages before this session. I'm honored to address for the first time the Human Rights Council to present my report, 20 years of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing, taking stock moving forward. On behalf of my predecessor, Leilani Farha, I will also briefly present her country visit report in New Zealand. Before I turn to my own report, let me commend New Zealand for inviting in February 2000 my predecessor, Leilani Farha, to their country. I also want to inform you that New Zealand sent comments welcoming the report and providing information about additional measures the government has taken since the visit. The country visit report argues that the housing crisis confronting New Zealand is a human rights crisis. There is a persistent lack of affordable housing, and in her view, consecutive governments have failed to ensure that the housing market meets the needs of the entire population, particularly those who have low income. Ms. Farha is concerned that the country has not yet enshrined the right to housing in its legal order in a manner that allows individuals to seek effective remedies for violations of this right through administrative, non-judicial, and judicial mechanisms. She therefore recommends to recognize the right to adequate housing as an enforceable right in national legislation and in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. Ms. Farha argues that housing policies must address historic injustices and displacement and the ongoing discrimination against Maori, Pacific peoples, and persons with disabilities. Housing policy should therefore be informed by the Treaty of Waitangi, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Dear delegates, let me now turn to my own report. My stock-taking report provides an overview of the achievements and contributions made by the mandate of the Special Rapporteur since it was established in the year 2000. It also offers information on my thematic priorities for the coming years. All our predecessors made an important contribution to clarify the normative content of the right to adequate housing by developing guidelines to address particular issues such as development-based evictions and displacement, security of tenure for the urban poor, and the implementation of the right to adequate housing. The ability of the rapporteur to respond quickly to unforeseen and unprecedented developments became evident last year. In her response to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, through the COVID-19 guidance notes. Taking office, I took lead in developing jointly with fellow experts a questionnaire on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on human rights, which informed my first thematic report to the General Assembly, containing key recommendations to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the right to adequate housing and to address long-standing housing exclusion and discrimination that became visible during the crisis. This brings me to the important contribution of thematic reports. The mandate has submitted 33 thematic reports to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, addressing various aspects related to the realization of the right to adequate housing, ranging from forced evictions, homelessness, the right to housing of women and persons with disabilities, to the issue of financialization of housing. The reports have contributed to raise awareness and bring to the attention of government, civil society, and other stakeholders obstacles and evolving challenges to the realization of the right to housing. The mandate has conducted 34 country visits since it was established. These visits provide an opportunity to engage in a direct dialogue with states at various levels and other stakeholders and assess the status of implementation of the right to adequate housing on the ground. Several states visited by the Special Rapporteur have used such visits as an opportunity to advance their own legal and policy reforms aimed at promoting and protecting the right to adequate housing, including Mexico, Kenya, Chile, and most recently, New Zealand. I hope to resume country visits as soon as possible. Virtual meetings can never replace the essential value of personal interaction during country visits and of seeing and properly understanding the realities and challenges public authorities and rights holders face. Since 1st December 2010, the Special Rapporteur has sent more than 385 communications to states and other actors. Since assuming office, I have devoted additional efforts to respond to information brought to my attention, as there has been a sharp increase of alleged housing rights violations during the COVID-19 pandemic. I have also embarked on a more proactive approach to address housing rights issues related to business enterprises or internationally financed development projects. The communications procedure of special procedures is one of the most accessible and fast international human rights complaints mechanisms. However, time and staffing capacities available to special rapporteurs allow them usually to work only on a fraction of communications received. In addition to communications, public statements remain essential to fulfill early warning capacities of the UN, and my report highlights recent examples in which either communications or public statements have been successful in contributing to the prevention of imminent housing rights violations. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought death and despair, but new opportunities as well for bilateral dialogue with diplomats and government representatives dealing with housing rights matters by virtual means. Such virtual meetings may particularly be called for when concerns indicate a grave breach or a pattern of housing rights violations. They may also be helpful to intervene in a constructive manner at an early stage before housing rights violations may actually take place. In order to ensure that they are effective, it is important that the Special Rapporteur can as well directly engage with government officials responsible for housing policies at national or local levels. Consideration must also be given to ensure better IT support, including platforms that allow for multilingual video conferencing with interpretation. The digitalization push should, however, not lose sight of those that are excluded, including many residents of informal settlements. Access to public services is one core component of the right to adequate housing. In the digital age, this means also having access to an internet connection. Dear delegates, let me now turn to my future priorities. My first thematic report to the General Assembly called attention to the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on marginalized communities, including racial, ethnic, and other minorities, women and children, the fragility of temporary measures to secure right to housing, including eviction moratoria, and the continuing evidence of a high number of forced evictions during the pandemic. The pandemic is far from over yet and will leave us with profound challenges for the realization of all economic, social, and cultural rights in the years to come. Home has never been more central to health and indeed life and death as it has been during the pandemic. Yet, the rebuilding path ahead appears very fragile, and there must be a rededication to a human rights-oriented response to the pandemic based on sustainable development goals, with housing at the heart of the recovery. Discrimination in relation to housing is an important matter, which has not lost its urgency since the mandate was established in the year 2000, with an explicit reference to non-discrimination in its official title. Taking this issue seriously, I have decided to focus my next reports to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council on discrimination and spatial segregation. Discrimination is at the heart of the denial of the right to adequate housing, as racial and ethnic minorities, indigenous people, women, older persons, LGBTQ communities, and migrant workers face tremendous barriers in accessing adequate housing. Spatial segregation often exists in parallel with highly unequal discriminatory access to a range of human rights, including, for example, the rights to water, sanitation, work, education, healthcare, physical integrity, and movement. Disparities in access to all public services, in security and policing are not uncommon in many cities and human settlements. Too often, the degree of protection and access to water, electricity, education, and healthcare depends on where one lives. Discrimination and segregation are entrenching divisions between communities and making it more difficult to make meaningful progress towards achievement of the right to adequate housing and other human rights. The rise of global movements for racial justice during the last decade clearly illustrated the need to tackle the vast disparities between poor communities and the very wealthy, and between racial, ethnic, and religious groups. States have an important role in curbing housing discrimination and addressing spatial segregation through legislation and policies. The climate crisis is one of the most critical challenges facing the right to adequate housing and all economic, social, and cultural rights. The question is how these rights can be realized in a manner which does not worsen but mitigates climate change. It is therefore essential to imagine housing in ways which do not depend on increasing material consumption and increase appropriation of space and nature. Housing rights advocates have advocated for minimal floor sizes to avoid overcrowding and ensure decent living conditions. They have done so rightly, but it is also time to think about wasteful and unsustainable housing, undermining the enjoyment of rights for others and contributing to the current climate crisis. Another major focus of my work will revolve around the right to housing and its nexus, humanitarian law and humanitarian response. Under international criminal laws, some systematic or widespread violations of the right to adequate housing, such as forced displacement and wanton destruction of housing, may lead to state responsibility and individual criminal accountability. In addition, the increasingly urban character of displacement poses challenges to the relationship between displaced communities and host communities, and to the provision of infrastructure and services. A search for durable solutions in respect to shelter and housing must therefore emphasize security of tenure and area-based approaches, be inclusive, and emphasize as well the broader needs of the wider host communities in which displaced persons live. There is a need for more detailed international guidelines on resettlement and relocation. The absence of such international guidelines results in widely varying approaches to eligibility criteria for project-affected people, compensation for loss of land and housing rights, due process, consultation, participation, and consent requirements for relocation and site selection, and benefit sharing arrangements. The result is that resettlement and relocation records of too many countries are in serious breach of human rights law and defeat the development objectives, including the Sustainable Development Goals, which the states have set for themselves. There is also a need to rethink land governance as it is central for the realization of the right to adequate housing. Land use in much of the world used to be based on plural mutual understandings between neighboring groups and those who live together. This has been eliminated by key legal and planning tools deployed by states such as eminent domain, also known as compulsory acquisition. The erasure of plural tenure arrangements by statist regimes and land grabbing by agro and other businesses has undermined security of tenure of land and contributes to forcible evictions and displacement. Dear delegates, let me conclude with my last area of focus, the role of private and public actors in ensuring accessible and affordable housing. In many countries, renters find it difficult to afford housing at a reasonable cost. At the same time, the stock of social and public housing for low-income households has often decreased or was sold to private actors. Private actors, the developers, financiers, credit institutions, and intermediate market institutions